I still didn't see him pop up.
Mr. Barron, are you there?
I'm waiting for word here. I'm using the calendar invite Zoom. He says still no go. Could you send him another invite, just the latest, Hank?
Yes.
Let's see. Always one. There it comes.
There we go. I think we should be good to go.
All set, Mr. Co-Chairman. I think.
All right. Okay, let's, can we take roll call, please?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is for roll call for the July 31st meeting of the Regulatory Reduction Task Force Housing Working Group. Representative Davis.
Here.
Director Matthews.
Present.
Mr. Barron.
He's
I
here.
see him. Ms. Delancey. She's here. Mr. Martin.
Here.
Sorry, not here.
Mike's here.
Co-Chairman Guru.
Here.
And Chairman Nicholas.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you. All right. So, yeah, Mr. Co-Chair, any opening remarks from you?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. No, boy, we had a good group this morning working on ag issues and look forward to a robust conversation this afternoon, which I have no doubt will occur. And appreciate your help on this one. So you get the afternoon shift. And but really do thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Hank, and the staff for putting this up and get this together. Thank everybody that submitted information, letters. Got a few of them on this one. So I'm ready to roll.
Okay, Hank, I'm going to flip over to you. Just kind of run us through our recap from June 19th and also just kind of work through the language of what our working group purpose is.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, members of the working group, Hank Oversland, LSO. So the full task force, as many of you may recall, met on June 19th here in Cheyenne for an informational meeting to kind of gather information and get an idea of what they want to do with this entire task force. And as part of that, they created 3 subgroups or working groups. The first one, the agriculture one, met this morning. We have the housing one now, and then there's an energy one meeting tomorrow afternoon. So the purpose of this housing one really came from a Harvard Growth Lab study that you may recall that presented at the June 19th meeting of the task force that showed that some of the issues around workforce and affordable housing issues might not be so much around costs, but really the costs of regulations. So regulations locally and at state level. So I think trying to flesh that out and give more of an idea to the full task force and management council, the governor, the task force is meant to report by October 1st. That can be pushed back by management council to the governor, management council, and any joint interim standing committees to give them ideas of legislation or different things that they can do to reduce the regulatory burden in Wyoming, to make it a more business-friendly state. And this task force, especially as it's named the housing one, is to look at affordable housing, how they can create that and make it a little bit easier. So that's all I have, and I'll stand for any questions.
Okay, any questions from the subcommittee members on that statement? So, ladies and gentlemen, you can see we tweaked the our agenda a little bit, because what in part I would like to do, we're going to run through some of the building codes, local issues, and committee directives, and also get some demographic data. There's a regulatory burden survey and housing studies, and I kind of like to trip through those rather quickly as we move forward through those, and then get back to the fundamental reason for meeting, which is how do we address the housing issues in Wyoming? What are they, and what regulatory hurdles are there that we can address basically through legislative action of some form or another? Because ultimately that's the purpose of the legislature, is to find solutions to things like that. And I think it's important to note that obviously there are different issues from different counties, but on a whole, the regulatory process, I think over time, just as a nature of regulatory authority in general, seems to be a blossom that never stops giving. And so we'll work through those issues and the costs of those issues. And then towards the end of the afternoon, I'd like to kind of just have a round robin on, from each of you as members, on where you think the problems are, what possible solutions are, both legislatively and otherwise, and then comments on the directives of how you would like to see this working group proceed and the committee as a whole proceed, and how we organize that through time, how much we can get done between now and December. There's almost a perfect likelihood that this committee and the working groups will continue past the legislative session. So we can have short-term objectives and goals. We can have medium-term objective and goals and long-term objective and goals. And one of the discussions that we had on June 19th was that one of the primary outcomes from this process may be a full regulatory overview or oversight entity that is legislatively directed, but a working group, so that you have more than just legislators involved in it. So it can be open to the communities and to help facilitate and use the maximum amount of qualified individuals to actually accomplish what we want to get done in Wyoming. So And with that, then I'll just go on to topic number 2, which is, this is something that we asked for, and it was at the conclusion of our meeting. There wasn't quite full time for it. And this is the building codes of Wyoming. And so let's just jump over to Byron, and we'll please take it away, Byron.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the task force. The document that was provided is in our meeting materials, and that document is 2-01. That talks about the International Fire Code, Building Code, Mechanical Code, Existing Building Code, Fuel Gas Code, and the National Electrical Code. At the time we prepared the memo, we're just about ready to transition, and we now have on July 1st transferred over to the 2023 International Electrical Code. Those codes establish the minimum standard for construction in the state of Wyoming, and they also establish the minimum expectation for locals as they begin to construct commercial facilities or assembly or public type buildings as described in the code in each of those jurisdictions. One thing I want to make perfectly clear is none of these codes get into when we talk about affordable housing and we get into the regulatory restriction on home, single family and multifamily dwellings. So 1 and 2 family dwellings, those are regulated out of the International Residential Code, which is not adopted by the state. It is, however, adopted by many localities across our great state, and many of, whether it's municipalities or counties that do that. But that expectation is not established at the state level. Under Wyoming statute, it further clarifies the size of structure, the use of structure, talking multi-story public buildings. We talk about bars, above ground fueling. When we talk about below ground fuel sites, those are regulated by our friends at the Department of Environmental Quality. It further goes on to talk about the fees that are established by statute, and then talks about the plan review requirements and expectations. I'm happy to answer questions, Mr. Chairman. I know that was a brief overview. Just, if we need to go into more depth, or I can explain more, by all means.
Yeah, before we, I see Cindy's got her hand up, but before we do, can you just explain, as I understand it, these codes are written, they're primarily safety codes and adequate construction processes. But when you adopt a code like this, does that mean that from a regulatory standpoint, that the city or the county or whoever adopts it has to follow it, or or is it something that is a recommendation? How do you know when you can, if something doesn't make sense in one particular situation or fit the code, what's the process, at least pursuant to the codes themselves?
Yeah, great question. So that's a multifaceted answer. So the first portion of that I want to cover is the statute's very specific in that the minimum standard for the locals is what the state adopts, meaning that the code sections of the code cannot be removed. Now they can become more stringent, but they can't be less restrictive than the minimum standard that the state adopts on those codes that we called out earlier. However, the great thing about these construction codes, the great thing about the consensus codes as these are designed, is there are also provisions that allow for a more prescriptive versus a cut and dry interpretation of the code. So in unique circumstances or while working with the design team, there are prescriptive measures that allow for the intent of the code to be achieved without following the letter of the code. As Chairman Guru talked about earlier this morning, I'll really chime into the fact of the success of these codes is a cooperation and a collaboration on how to make the building safe. These codes are a minimum standard, and there's an opportunity for us to do great things when everyone comes to the table and has that ability to say, okay, in this particular instance, how do we get from A to B in that construction process? And the code specifically does allow for that in that prescriptive ability to interpret those codes.
And just to follow up on that, it seems to me that what you would call prescriptive varies from code to code. I mean, the Uniform Building Code is different from the Uniform Electrical Code, and one is necessarily a little bit more strict or confined than the other because of the broad gamut of that is captured within the building code, for example, versus electricity is, it's you're working with dynamite in essence, and so the rules are different, and your ability to get to work around them is different.
Yeah, sorry, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, absolutely. So so when we do fire code, building code, mechanical code, existing building code, and fuel gas codes, those consensus codes are all written so that the language is similar and or identical in each of those codes. And you are very correct. When we move over to the standard for the National Electrical Code, that is a very by the letter adoption of that code. And that's it's a standard as opposed to the consensus codes. The consensus codes allow for a different process on how that code is written and established and the expectations established thereof.
Okay, Cindy, go ahead.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I was just trying to unmute myself. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate, this information. Kind of drilling down a little bit more on your remarks, Mr. Chairman. What I consistently hear, and I know we're discussing housing today, so if we need to save this for another point in time, I'm certainly happy to hold my comments, but I think what I'm about to say kind of impacts this housing discussion, because when you look at 35.9.106, these codes are adopted by the council, essentially, which is the fire council. And when you look at that language, the language specifically says the council shall adopt rules and regulations to 1, establish minimum fire standards not exceeding the standards prescribed by the International Fire Code, the Building Code, the Mechanical Code, blah, 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 so on and so forth. And then it goes on to say all new building construction or remodeling, so my point there is that the statute basically provides for the notion of 5 unelected people to be adopting these codes that are setting a minimum standard when the legislature specifically prescribed in the statute that these do not have to be that floor, that these can be the ceiling. So there is something that could happen a little bit less. And why I just bring this, out for conversation and review is I think everyone on this committee, everyone is dedicated to protecting the public, but I hear consistently that there's an enormous amount of confusion, that there's some, difference in interpretation amongst jurisdictions, and as we just heard the fire marshal say, people can go above local, like this seems to be a common drumbeat that I'm hearing, Mr. Chairman. And I just thought maybe it was worthy of some review, as far as really looking at, why has Wyoming decided to adopt these international codes that maybe are not fit for purpose for us in Wyoming to be that floor instead of the ceiling. So I just kind of throw it out there, as far as wanting to learn a little bit more on kind of what the thought process is of the council and why, knowing that this becomes quite a quandary for some, if there's any way to maybe kind of be a little bit more, offer some more flexibility so we can get people building in a way that it's not just feels like it's so confined and restricted by these international codes. So just throwing that out there for discussion.
Well, and you're presuming that when the legislature does this, that they have any idea what they're just adopting. And the fact is they don't. There's no way that the legislators know what is in the International Building Code, International Mechanics Code. And so this thing I agree from the standpoint that we adopt these things without knowing what the real impacts of those codes are, and if there are alternatives. And for just when we were building the state capitol, we were working with 3 different codes, and we would do certain things under the 2016 code and certain things under the 2021 code. Now we have the 2023 codes, and some of those things we could not have gotten done under the current codes that we did using the 2016 code, because it's more restrictive. And so we're kind of creating our own fence around us, and we don't quite even understand what we're doing when we're doing it. It's just a true story, and it's because it's the big complicated issues.
And if I may just follow up on that, Mr. Chairman, it's not so much that I think there's an expectation for the legislature to be experts on these codes, because what the legislature has done is created a council to adopt rules and regulations to establish minimum fire standards. And the key words here are not exceeding the standards prescribed in the fire code. So how I read that and what I interpret that to mean, and obviously the fire marshal is our subject matter expert, but that this council could set standards below these international codes. It's simply saying you can't go above that. But for whatever reason, the council has decided that, to just kind of plug these international codes in as somewhat, of that's what the policy decision that has been made. So I just was curious on, what the rationale is of the council, knowing that these, maybe there might be some circumstances in Wyoming which require a little bit more flexibility. So these codes, are still protecting the public's health and safety, but not being the regulatory conundrum that seems to keep cropping up in multiple circumstances. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mark, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Fire Marshal Matthews. I also have a question regarding, it was interesting to hear that the IRC is not state required. That's a local, either municipality or county requirement. And I appreciate that. I'm going to mayor, I have certainly had the pleasure of trying to adopt codes, which, as you said, Mr. Chairman, are full of language that are well beyond my ability to absorb as an elected official, and that was a shared experience amongst us. So I do have a couple of questions. The IRC, or the IBC, refers 3 attached dwelling units to the IBC, regardless of the size of the structure. Perhaps the structure as small as gross area of 3,000 square feet, maybe less. Whereas a 10,000 square foot single family home is regulated in the residential building code, the IRC. That 3-unit attached residential unit, which can be a real source of free market workforce housing, is, despite its much smaller size, is kicked up into the International Building Code. And I just want to understand, is that a state requirement, Mr. Fire Marshal, or is it local? And what's the reasoning behind that? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Chairman. So to answer the question is, to, once again, like a lot of the code answers, is multifold. So when those homes move to, when they go from 3, 4, 5, 6 dwelling units, they move out. That is absolutely correct. They move out of the residential building code and into the international residential code and move to the international building code. The consensus code, and the reason that the code is written in that manner, is the justification that's been provided is now we're looking at multifamily with a more transient population in nature. So they're wanting to ensure that those buildings are built to a different standard or a safer standard, i.e. when we talk about hotel, motel, and apartment buildings. So providing that additional means of egress, providing to ensure the secondary egress out of those structures. to get down to that, there is the ability within the IRC to divide those structures by construction type. So you can make them smaller than what they may be. You could potentially build that building in a different manner, as we talk about in that prescriptive requirement, that you separate each of the structures. Therefore, you don't meet you don't hit the thresholds that pull you up to the International Building Code.
And a quick follow-up, and this is beyond, but this is definitely attached to this housing task force. So residential zoning in a municipality that requires 3 dwelling units on a single lot, 7,400, 7,500 square foot lot, to be in compliance. And yet the IBC triggers building code requirements and construction requirements that make it virtually impossible to be in compliance at 3 units on a 7,400 square foot lot. It's an interesting conundrum.
Mr. Chairman.
So I'll put it this way. You take an existing house that has a basement apartment, you want to add 1 more unit. Adding that 1 more unit takes that existing home and basement apartment and requires them to be fire sprinkled, and then other IBC building code requirements as well. So there's no grandfathering for the existing units. That 1 additional 800 square foot apartment, or that, whatever it is, triggers you into a whole new realm of expense and development requirements. And I just didn't understand why that was.
So just to follow up on that question, Mark, for the going from 2 to 3 is the trigger under one particular code, or
Yeah, the new zoning in this coding zoning neighborhood is 3 dwelling units per city lot, residential. Your lot is 7,400 square feet. You have setbacks. If you have 2 units on your a single family home with an attached ARU, and you want to comply, you must add either an attached, which would be the preference because you've got a postage size residential lot, or somehow a detached while meeting setbacks in order to avoid the IBC. So if you have the 3 units, by nature, you would attach them. It would be a smaller structure that way, and it would be compliant with the zoning, the basic zoning. But the IBC requirement of 3 units becoming a multifamily commercial development makes it virtually prohibitive to do that. Maybe you could do that with brand new construction. Scrape an existing non-compliant home and do your 3 units. But if we're trying to allow housing to flourish, there's nothing better than existing housing stock and adding to that. That's the basis of the question. It's very confusing.
and just to put that into context, you're referring to about is this the new regs that are coming out of Teton County?
Now, these regs came out 3 or 4 years ago out of the town of Jackson and Teton County.
So is it countywide or city and county?
It's in the city. It's a zoning district in the city designed to create more residential density on single lot residential lots. And of course, you could combine residential lots and make a larger dwelling opportunity.
Well, it sounds to me it might be designed to do that, but it does just the opposite.
Well, it's resulting in the opposite in some circumstances, for sure. We're trimming down housing instead of adding housing because of the physical constraints and it's very significant additional expense of meeting the IBC rather than the residential building code. I just wanted to understand that. And
Okay, we'll go back to Byron, and then we've got Representative Davis has got his hand up, and also Mike Martin also has his hand up. So Go
Mr.
ahead,
Chairman,
Brian.
Thank you. The point of clarity I want to really give on this is I do understand there are some constraints as we talk about the construction of the building. But the key to these codes, and the thing I want to make perfectly clear, is these codes do not set minimum lot sizes. They don't set zoning sizes. They don't set local property uses. Those are all determined by our localities, whether it be county, municipality, or otherwise. These standards, and our friends to the north did a lot of work on this in Montana, of saying that locals can't do that because to the point, it makes it very difficult. The codes, we're actually talking about the physical construction of the building. There are multiple facets of that, but part of this challenge and part of, I think, the issue on that housing concern is how they're being restricted locally. At the state, we're not restricting that.
Representative Davis.
Yeah, my question is similar in a lot of ways, but we're a state of only 500,000 people. When did we become international? Most of the people in our state live in rural communities, and for people to clean up a lot and redesign a home or remodel or anything like that, it costs prohibitive trying to, we need to be grandfathered back in to the original one somehow. But I mean, when you bring these new standards in, people can't do it. It's cost prohibitive. And we're talking in communities of 400 or 500 people. This international stuff, square footage and things that all plays into this are ludicrous for the common sense in rural Wyoming. And we're stifling ourselves. We cannot build in rural Wyoming simply because of these codes and these regulations. There has to be a way to grandfather it in, or however you want to do it, but there has to be a way to work with common sense in these smaller communities in order for them to develop any residual new housing of any sort.
Okay, Mike, go ahead.
Thank you. Question, a little different line, but just wanted to ask, I know State Fire Marshal Byron used to be working for the city of Cheyenne. You said that many of these municipalities are adopting more stringent codes than what is prescriptive from the state. How prevalent is that across the state first? And then I don't want your opinion because it's not fair to you to ask that, but it's how is that affecting affordable housing across the state? And then maybe along the lines, I know that the state of Montana legislature has put some restrictions across the local county and city municipalities on that. So how many communities, in your opinion, have adopted more stringent code than what you have established by the legislature at the state level?
Mr. Chairman, back to Mr. Martin. Off the top, I can tell you that the local adoption is in our more densely populated. So Albany counties, Laramie counties, Natrona, Sweetwater. And if typically the county has done it, Campbell County, the county has done it, then the cities have done it. So that prevalence of a more stringent requirement is in our more dense areas of population. There are some of our other rural counties who have done that. The west side of the state is really being impacted by that growth. So they're looking at ways to make sure that the structures they're building are safe. So we've got some other folks. I was just in Kimmerer to meet with the city administrator there to help them walk through some things so they have an understanding of where they're going. So the more stringent, whether it's UDC or those development requirements are in our more dense areas, and then they're adopting that residential code and then setting expectations, whether it be lot size or parking, landscape, so on and so forth, that's making it restrictive. To the affordability comment, I like to share, I smile when I say this, I like to share. I had a great opportunity right after our last committee meeting. I was actually invited to participate with HUD, the International Code Council, and the home builders in Washington, D.C., as we talked about what is affordable and sustainable housing in the country. And there are really, really big numbers that you all are aware of the amount of housing that we need, as well as the amount of housing that's needed across the country. While it's not in line with regulatory reduction, there are two standards that all of these home manufacturers referenced while we were there, that for them said, you know, that gives them the ability or the level playing field to construct a housing at a more affordable level and bring it into these communities at a more reasonable expectation. Those standards also establish an expectation that those homes and all of the fixtures are inspected and certified before they leave that facility. Meaning that some of this, not some, a lot of the local inspection responsibility goes away because those items are certified by one company and then attested to by another. So they have to have a certification and effectively a licensure or an accreditation to manufacture those facilities. Then the local would look at the electrical meter, water connections, and then those homes are ready to move into. So while it's not necessarily regulatory reduction by adding standards for those, it does take the amount of regulation in the field to a lower level, which in turn should be less restrictive for those homes to be built in that manner. And Mr. Martin, if you had one more on the end of that, I didn't get it on my note, so.
No, I think that covers it. Thank you.
So Brian, what you're talking about is having a private entity who may be a home builder in one hand, also be certified on the other, so that in the field, they can work with each other so they don't have to wait in line to walk through the certification process when we only have 2 fire marshals and plus, a few county ones around the state.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's the opportunity there is it allows the builder to have a certification and then they partner with a third party to get their accreditation. So effectively what they do is to eliminate the proverbial term, someone may say that you have the fox watching the hen house. In this case, they actually have got a secondary oversight that makes sure their accreditation meets those requirements. So you're getting 2 eyes or 2 inspections. And those builders that we had an opportunity to meet with in DC were very receptive to those standards. And the Commonwealth of Virginia, I know it's a long way from here, and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts both have really good programs that they do a lot of that work in.
So is there some type of immunity or bonding or license or component to that?
If indeed the state, Mr. Chairman, if indeed the state were to adopt those standards, yeah, inside the standard, it sets that expectation of what the consumer is paying for and what the actual product is when it arrives. And if indeed we wanted a second portion of that, we could look at that. But looking at those programs, visiting with those folks, those are very sound programs and they have a very good fundamental basis. Looking at the products while we were there in DC, because they did allow us that opportunity. From my standpoint, they look like very well-built homes, and the fact that they could build them in a factory, bring them out, assemble them on the National Mall, allow us to look at them, and then move them to their new home where they're going to reside for the rest is pretty impressive. And those folks were good to work with.
So I'm curious, just to follow up, there was discussion about what Montana has done. Could you tell us briefly, or what your understanding is, that whether they've actively, essentially, it sounds to me, reined in to some degree what you can do by ordinance or by zoning on the statewide basis?
Yes. So our friends that actually did the Harvard work, they provided that link. And what I'll do here in just a second is I'll share that in the chat. I've got the article up. But what it did was it limited what the locals could do when it came down to the zoning, the density, and those more restrictive clauses that were impacting that local housing stock.
Bob, did you have your hand up?
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, my question on this is, are we talking about pre-manufactured mobile homes or housing? What about the people in our communities that build these houses? The jobs that are lost because we're exporting it and then we're bringing something in simple, ready to go on the ground? I don't understand where the economics are in that. You know, we're trying to look for jobs for our people in Wyoming, not outsource them to pre-manufactured mobile or modular homes. I'm a little confused in there. We need to do something with the regulations here, not out there. Does that make sense?
Go ahead, Byron.
Mr. Chairman, to the representative, I would look at it from this standpoint, given the opportunity that if we adopted the standards and we as Wyoming set the benchmark for those, we could bring those manufacturing jobs to our smaller communities. We could bring those to our folks that need that work. I think it's an opportunity for us to succeed, not fail.
Well, let's move on a little bit, because we're we're getting down to our general discussion topics when we get down further down our list. And I think this is essentially what we're going to get back to, these issues that we've started to talk about. So, so keep that, your follow-up question in your head, Bob, and we'll come back to you. So let's, Byron, anything else on the building codes that you'd like to share?
I think that really covers it, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So that next is the locality issues. And then we've got contractor licensing, zoning and land use plans, and permit timing. And so, Hank, who was going to start this off?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that the county commissioners are here, and then we also have WAM here, so you can start with whoever you would like.
Who would like to go?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman.
Hey, Jeremiah.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. I'm Jeremiah Riemann here on behalf of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. Also joined live with by Jonathan Russell, who is serving as a policy analyst in our office and who assisted with much of the data collection, and he'll be able to clean up anything that I get wrong in my testimony. Mr. Chairman, we did submit a spreadsheet to the committee, which I do see is posted online, that outlines answers to several questions that we heard from you. We added a couple of inquiries to continue that line of thinking. We're happy to continue digging into this data. We do have some answers that are outstanding, and we'll continue to collect those and bring them back to the committee as we receive those. As you can see from the document that is now on the screen, we asked the counties, one, do you impose zoning regulations? And what we heard is that there are 8 counties currently without any form of zoning regulations, which leaves 15 counties with some form. 4 of those counties only zone a portion of the county. So for example, Bighorn County does have some zoning regulation, but it's only for airport protection zones and mapped floodplain zones. Other areas of the county are not zoned in any way. And you'll see that in variations across many of the counties. We've tried to break that down by zoning type, and you can see some of that on this page and others. We'll continue to dig into that as I suggested and make sure that you have all of the answers. There was a question about whether counties have contractor licensing in place. And what we found is that only 2 counties currently have contractor licensing, Laramie County being one of those examples, and they only focus on electrical contracting. Teton County is the other county, of course, with contractor licensing. I don't have the full answer of the extent of that. We have a former commissioner here. Perhaps he can, a couple of former Teton County commissioners here, they could certainly elaborate on that. But again, we'll bring back more information in that particular area in the days ahead. We did also look at the types of permits that are issued, and you can see that those mostly involve wastewater systems, but there are other building or construction development permits that are issued. Generally for those smaller permits, the time frame to put those in place is generally a matter of days, not weeks, and certainly not months. For minor subdivisions, and again, we've got more data to collect for you, but what we saw is for initial reviews in, say, Sublette County, it's 10 to 15 days, up to max approvals that we found in our research were a few months, 120 days, as you can see there for Crook County. Major subdivisions certainly take longer, generally in the time frame of 75 days to 5 to 8 months in Park County. We did provide some links to regulations that the counties have and some other information that we collected. I will just make one other thing in terms of issues that we heard from the counties relative to their ability to respond to permits. The most common response that we heard about issues with responding to whether it was permits or subdivision applications is the fact that all too often applications are submitted with incomplete information or incorrect information, which does stall things. Now, some counties have instituted pre-application consultation phase, which is intended to try and reduce that and make sure that the county and the applicant are better aligned. We also heard that other permitting agency review or permitting themselves, such as the Department of Environmental Quality for some water projects or the state engineer can add timeframes to the project. Not to suggest that we heard that they're inappropriate, just that they can add time. We also heard about the complexity of the project that might be proposed. And then another one that we've seen play out in a couple of counties. I'll use Lincoln County as an example, which for a long time was searching for a new planner. In fact, they had hired a new planner and that person never arrived in the county as we've all battled to fill positions, which put them behind the 8 ball as they've tried to work. They now do have a county planner and are making progress and cutting down timelines, but it did add some process and some frustration from everybody, including the county commissioners. With that, Mr. Chairman, again, we will continue to work with WildPass, the Planner Association for counties, municipalities, and others to refine this information. But this is what we were able to collect for you at this point in time. And with that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions that there may be.
Questions for Jeremiah? So I have a couple, Jeremiah. When I look at this list, my first question is, well, it's twofold. One is that, you know, if in your rules and your regs or your zoning, you say that you will respond to a permit application within 30 days, and you don't do it, typically there's, or in some situations, there's no recourse. And so my question is, how do we know, that these days that the counties volunteered are accurate? And if you look at some of the other surveys that's coming up, in some locations, my understanding is you've got 1,000 to 1,500 days to typically get through a building permit process, because it's not just a building permit process. It's has components of water, sewer, spacing, all kinds of other components to it that all stack up on top of each other. And with no ability to say, look, your time frame is over. Now what do I do? I know that some places have enacted legislation that says if you say you're going to do something in 45 days, then if you don't do it, then it's automatically approved. And so I'm just curious about the county's input on that type of a tool, but also how do we get real numbers that are not just kind of, this is what our typical practice is or what happens. And so then one of my thoughts are, and I was going to leave this with the working group, is that as this process moves forward, it may be useful that we set up a website that allows individuals and or contractors who can then write in or send in and provide us descriptive analyses of on the ground impacts, where, just for example, one county says you can do something, get a building permit and be off and running in 3 months. And if they see that, and it took them 2.5 years, then we get the rest of the story. And how does this committee and all of us get educated on the real world versus of what you're required to statutorily or admit or through rule and reg of the various counties and municipalities?
Mr. Chairman, I believe there are questions for me and perhaps questions there for the committee. I'll try and respond with the county perspective, understanding that additional information is needed. Mr. Chairman, I think the sense from my members is that they want to be efficient with these processes and ensure that economic development, housing stock are all able to occur within the state of Wyoming. So I want to make sure that you understand we're aligned with you. In terms of the accuracy of the information here, we were on a very short time frame to collect this information. In fact, I believe the time frame information that was requested just came to us a week or so ago. And in fact, in that request, it indicated that anecdotal information was acceptable. So what we've tried to do is simply provide you what we could get to you as quickly as possible. As I mentioned, we need to refine this and ensure that what we are representing, in fact, is what an individual, a developer should experience in their particular county. And in relationship to what I understand the question to be, should there be automatic approvals in certain circumstances? Perhaps, and we can certainly take a look at what that might look like when that's appropriate. I do think that there are some things here that simply require additional analysis. Some of these issues deal with the health and safety of our constituents across the state, and that's the basis of why county commissioners exist, right? They are to look out for the health, safety, welfare, and general morals of the county. That's clearly written into the zoning statutes. I also believe there are some things that are entirely outside of the control of the county. And so if you had an automatic approval and those things simply transpired, I mentioned the issue in Lincoln County, despite the commissioner's best efforts to ensure that they had adequate staff. We've all been experiencing shortfalls in staffing inability to deal with that. Others are permits that are required from other state agencies, other local agencies, et cetera. So again, I think we can talk about that and look at where it's appropriate, understanding that we need to ensure the safety of everyone involved, at the same time trying to get to the right place, which is certainly something the county commissioners want to do.
Okay, any further questions for Jeremiah on the first? And first of all, Jeremiah, thanks for getting out the survey and getting results back. I think that the more information we have, the better off we'll be. And hopefully you'll continue to, we'll work on this as this committee moves along and start going down into a, more specific breakouts by county and by region and obviously every county is different. Some are a lot more aggressive about economic growth than others. And so we have to be mindful of obviously the regionalization of Wyoming and frankly, the personal property rights of property owners in each county. I mean, that's a dual task of all of us. So yeah, so I appreciate that.
Mr. Co-Chairman?
Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Jeremiah, thanks. And I was one of the ones that asked this question, so I appreciate you working. And I know Mr. Frazier too. That WHAM did the same thing and pulled a lot of information together quickly. And I guess my point in asking the question, I know major subdivisions and even minor subdivisions, depending on where they are, that does take some time. I was trying to drill down on just simple permits, single family home permits, grading permits, those types of things. And I know, and I understand what you're saying about incomplete information. Also gratified to hear you talk about pre-application conferences, especially on these small permits. It's like, whether it's just a checklist or whatever, to try to get folks, or even when we talked about this morning, using the technology that we have available, like the technology we're using to have this meeting, where someone can go on and go online and look and say, if you want to do a single family home on a lot, these are the things you need to do. These are the things you need to look at, and be able to go online and watch a video and say, this is what you need to do. Of course, contractors are more fluent in all that. Is that something, that you see as helping this equation? I'm leery of saying if we don't get a permit in 30 days, it's automatically approved. On the same token, I think if you haven't been heard from in 30 days, if I apply for a permit and I haven't heard from government and local or county, whoever, in 30 days, all of a sudden now I'm mad at two problems. I'm mad because I haven't been got a hold of it, and I'm mad because I don't have my permit yet. So that's where I'm trying to figure out, in an attempt that we all share to get that affordable housing, is, and maybe it's more of a thought to be kind of spur your thinking, and your commissioners and such be thinking, how can we do this in a timely fashion better? How can we use the new tools that we may have in the toolbox to do it? Do you see any applications there? Have any ideas for me?
I think this notion of an application checklist, if counties don't already have it, it seems to be a reasonable thing. I don't know the answer of how many do or don't have that. I'll certainly see if we can tease that information out. I do think that there are some spots here, as you mentioned, the application and not hearing back in a reasonable time frame. It seems very reminiscent of the solution perhaps that we put in place for public records, whereby a governmental entity has to respond within a time frame. I believe in that case it's roughly a week, to say, yes, we've received your application for those materials, and here's our time frame for responding within 30 days, whatever it may be. I think that communication, that's that's what we all thrive on, right? Is having some sort of a voice and a person to contact, and maybe that's something to take a look at further here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, go ahead, Bob.
I have one question for you also there on that. How does that affect like private property? You know, I want to go put a barn up or a shed on my ground, and it has to go through all this process at the county level where it's just on my private ground. It's just mine. It's not for public, like it's building and housing and stuff like that. Is there a way to just streamline that? You know, my chicken shed burnt down, so I need to build a new one tomorrow. So I go down to the county, I give them 25 bucks, I get my permit, and away I go. But what I'm hearing here is there's a lot more to just getting the permit, but we're dealing with two different things. Maybe private land has a different avenue of a building permit than something that is for sale or anything like that.
Well, that's a good point, Bob. And as indicated earlier, we've got 8 counties with absolutely no regs. So you can build a chicken barn and a mansion right next to it. You don't have to have anything. So thus is part of the issues that we're going to face at this committee is if we have to act tactically, because some places have building zoning issues and some places don't. And so that, we have to kind of assume what is and what isn't impacting housing in those localities. And if we enact laws, obviously in some counties it won't have much impact, or cities. But then we have to look at those folks need housing as well. So, it's a multifaceted way that we're going to have to address these issues. So any other ones want to respond to Bob's question?
Mr. Chairman, if I could, you mentioned the 8 counties that don't have zoning regulations. There's a distinction that can be made here, right? That the other 15, I mentioned that 4 only have it for a portion. What I mean by a portion is that only certain acreage within the county falls under zoning regulations. Of those 15 that have zoning regulations, it shouldn't just be assumed that they have regulations for every single activity that exists within that jurisdiction. The barn in some of those counties may be able to go forward without a permit, without falling under zoning regulations. Some others may have found a purpose or reason that would have to go through that process. So I think there are just variations and grades that exist throughout the state of Wyoming.
Okay, any follow-up? If not, please proceed. I think, anything else, Jeremiah? Go ahead, Cindy.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I'd like to kind of, again, bring us back to our discussion point on the code, the state adoption. Even though counties have, kind of self-proclaimed as they have no zoning, to Representative Dave's point, when he wants to go build his chicken shed, he thinks like let's just hypothetically assume, I'm in a county, they say there's no zoning, I can basically do what I want on my property. The brakes get put on when we then fall back and say, not so fast. You have this state, international codes that you have to comply with. And that's, again, I'm not debating the merits as to whether or not these are good or bad things. Like, please understand that. I'm just saying that it becomes very confusing when people think that they have that ability to move forward with a project on their property, only to have the brakes put on very fast and find out not only are the brakes on, but there's now a higher level of expense and time, and things aren't necessarily as one thought initially. because the interplay with some of these other codes that we started our discussion off with. So I just, that's a nuance in this conversation, but I just think it's worthy of just kind of remembering that there's some things in the background here, knowing that we have now 7 international codes adopted by the Fire Council in Wyoming.
Okay, for the comments. Jeremiah, anything else?
No, Mr.
All right, let's
Chairman.
go to the WAM presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Appreciate it. As Jeremiah stated, we also submitted some information. There's a PowerPoint that's attached to the agenda, the meeting information. There it is right there. I will mention, well, before I get into that, let me just indicate that and kind of echo some of what Jeremiah said, and that is that our members are all in. We, as you'll hear later in the day when we talk about our housing survey, it's an acute situation for almost all of our members and causing problems with economic development and quality of life. So anything that I will say that anything that's reasonable that we can do to help move the ball down the field in terms of the housing crisis, we're here for you. With the caveat, as I said at the previous meeting, as Jeremiah also said, with the caveat that we want to make sure that our mission, and in fact our duty is outlined in the statute to protect public health and safety. We, as long as whatever we do, as long as it allows us to maintain that mission or to the part of our mission that is to protect the public health and safety, that's important too. So just going to this presentation that we put together for you, we did put out a survey to our members. As a spoiler alert, on the last page of this presentation is a link that would take you to the raw data for the survey. That's a 45-page document. And so I'm not presenting that here, but there is a link in this at the last page of the presentation that would take you to the raw data. So having said that, where do things stand? We sent out this survey to 98 of our members. So far, we've heard back from 35 of those members. And if you look at the next page, you'll see the specific communities that have responded to the survey so far. And again, we'll continue to receive those and update this as long as we continue to receive some. But there's the specific communities who responded. There were three questions that were asked of us by the committee chairs, and that was to talk about zoning, contractor certification, and permit timeframes. So in answer to the question, does your municipality have zoning? 91% of the communities that responded do have zoning. And again, the raw data is available to you if you want to go and see exactly which of those communities there are. So almost all of our communities have that. The question was also included, are there any areas within your corporate boundaries that are exempt from zoning regulation? 82% didn't have any. 6 of the respondents did have some exemptions to the zoning regulations, and they fell into 3 categories. County pockets, obviously, in Cheyenne, Warren Air Force Base was exempt from that. And then also in a few undeveloped town, city-owned properties were also exempt. We asked what kind of zones are offered, and we found that varied among communities, but that it all fell within essentially the 4 broader categories of residential, commercial, industrial, and agricultural. Obviously, larger communities had more varied zones. For example, Worland offers single-family residential, multifamily residential, high-density residential, commercial, industrial, and estate residential, whereas Cheyenne breaks them down very much more specifically. And in the interest of time, I won't bother reading all of those that Cheyenne has. But again, as you would expect, the larger cities do break that down even further. We did ask what kind of, if they require contractor testing and certification, and only 37% of the communities did require that. On the next page, we asked, who do you require to be certified? And that varied, but and that varied as well, but not so much by size of community. The varying, and it did vary a little bit by size of community in terms of specialization, but it also varied largely in terms of need. For example, Cheyenne has, a board of public utilities, and many of the cities have their own, so they wouldn't require, plumbing, the sewer maintenance staff. They wouldn't require independent contractors there because sewer maintenance staff takes care of that. I will say that this started a pretty interesting conversation within WHAM, because as many of you know, WHAM used to do contractor testing statewide. And that was, in a day when technology, when we thought technology was advanced, right? WHAM had a room upstairs here in the building that we had a bunch of computers on, and we would do proctored exams right here in the building. We would also go around the state and do those proctored exams. There was some, not from this committee, I believe it was a corporations committee question about a year ago, should WHAM go back to that? I don't believe that's the best answer. And the reason I don't believe that's the best answer has more to do about customer service. And I will admit that, it does take a toll on our pretty small staff. So, but it also creates a situation where contractors have to come to Cheyenne to test or wait till we're in their part of the state. And I don't think that's really the best answer. We do have these cities that require contractor licensing and testing. We've started a conversation within WHAM about reciprocating recognition of those contractor licenses. In other words, if you're licensed, if you've been tested and licensed in Casper, would other cities recognize that? And again, we've had a very positive response to that. In fact, City of Cheyenne already has a process in place whereby they can recognize someone that's already licensed elsewhere without putting them through the entire process again. That is on a case-by-case basis as approved by the chief building official, as opposed to an automatic thing. But we've had some discussions and in-house here and have a pretty good reaction to cities being willing to reciprocate on those. And we think that might take care of some of the concerns that are coming from contractors about having to test in multiple jurisdictions. We don't, we certainly don't believe that's the only idea, but we think that's a good idea that we could make work. Moving on to permitting wait times. I will say that this focuses on building permits. And of course, there are various other kind of permits, but that seemed to be what the topic here is. So we were asked, we asked, how long does it take for permits such as a building permit or grading permit after an application has been turned in? And that ranged from 2 business days to a month. And the reason for we kind of found that the larger the city, the shorter that time, of course. There are small cities where the governing, where they don't have the building staff and the governing body only meets once a month. And so in those communities, it could take longer, as those would have to go in front of the governing body. One of the things that I can tell you regarding that last paragraph on this page, one of the things that I can tell you, having been, a practitioner at City Hall, is that one of the things that really can stretch that out, which the city doesn't have control of, is if an incomplete application is turned in, and that often frustrates both sides when incomplete applications are turned in and have to be turned back and asked for them to be completed. And so we did ask that question. How many of them are complete on the first crack? And we got responses between 20 and 85% on those. So you see, even in the best case, in the best cases, at least 15% of those come in, not complete the first time around. And so I would just make the side comment that if we were to have you know, a requirement of a certain number of days to respond. I don't think we'd have a problem with that kind of accountability, but I would want to make sure that it's not a certain number of days to approve it, but rather to respond to it, because I don't think that there should be a requirement to approve an incomplete application, and we certainly wouldn't want to create any kind of gamesmanship over that. I'll certainly stand for questions, but that's a quick overview. I'll indicate again on the last page of the is not only our contacts, but also a link where you can go and see the raw data. If you're curious about how each town reacts or responded, that's contained in that raw data that you can find at that link. Mr. Chairman, I ran through that fairly quickly. I'd certainly be willing to take questions.
Okay, questions for David? Go ahead, Mark.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, gentlemen, for all that feedback. I would like to speak to, when we're talking about a time frame for building permits. I don't know the last time a building permit was processed in the municipality I live in or the county I live in 30 days. And I think that's an ambitious goal. I do understand the complexities with processing a building permit, but I will say that with increasing regulation in communities such as Jackson and Teton County, and I have participated in increasing that regulation. But bear in mind, we have zoning districts which have different sizes and for buildings, setbacks, heights, LSO parking, uses defined on each zoning. Then we have zoning overlays with a natural resource overlay, a wildlife migration corridor, perhaps wetlands, engineering issues. And then we have mitigation, housing mitigation. Mitigation is so complex. The individual who actually calculates it must have an advanced math degree in our community to determine what that mitigation is going to be. I bring this up because pulling a permit for something even as simple as a barn now requires, because of the complexity and the layers of regulation in this community, it requires hiring a professional or multiple professionals to make sure that they get everything in that building application that is required, that does address all the zoning overlays, that does address mitigation. And so when we say an increasing number of applications come in incomplete, I hope, gentlemen, we bear in mind that, and I mean the county and WAM representatives, Chairman Matt, we create that complexity at local government. And then we expect that bar to be met. And a layman cannot do it anymore. So I just want to get those comments out there. And I would ask for your feedback to those specific concerns.
You bet. Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Please.
Hang on, I'm making a couple of notes, so I hope to capture the question and get a proper response to it. One of the things that we are in an increasingly complex world, and the codes are updated by the International Council typically annually. And when I say updated, you could equate that with made more complex. And so it does increasingly become a little more complex. One of the things, and let me just throw this in as a side note, we're talking about a building permit here. Of course, if you're starting with a raw piece of land and you first need to zone and subdivide and all that, that does take considerably more time, because there are, as Mr. Barron knows, and as those of you who've worked, I know that Chairman has also worked in municipal government a little bit. As you know, there's required public hearings and public notices, and those are a required period of time, and those add up to each other. So if you're talking about zoning or subdividing, you are talking about a longer period of time. A building permit on a simple structure shouldn't take very long, and on a more complex structure, of course, would. Just a couple of comments about the building code itself, even though that was kind of a prior discussion I wasn't in on. In one of the states I worked at, and I've admitted to you guys before, I'm a recovering city manager. I've worked in 4 different cities. And one of the states I was in, we kind of, our community, we were allowed to adopt the building code. And of course we did because, for the reasons I stated previously, but we weren't required to adopt the current one. And in fact, the community I was in, we kind of purposely lagged a couple of years because it created complexities for the contractors to be getting up to date on the new stuff. And so we kind of purposely did that. I believe that would be allowed in Wyoming to have that kind of a lag. I don't know the degree to which that would help. I'd also mention there was kind of some talk about whether about us adopting the international business codes, or building codes, whether that's really fits us. And I think the simple answer is that's who does building codes. There are only a couple of states I know about that have their own building codes rather than adopting the international codes, and they're larger states. The only 2 I'm aware of are New York and Texas. And so, it would be I think Wyoming could. I think it would be quite an undertaking. I don't know that it would be a bad thing, but it would be, again, quite an undertaking for that to take place. I think it is, and like I say, cities. I'm going to refer back to, at the risk of being on my soapbox, I'm going to refer back to some comments of the co-chair early on, and that is, it's important. I think it's incumbent upon on municipalities to create a culture in which the building department feels like it's their job to get to yes, not to just say no. And there are culturally, there's some disincentives to that. It is no is the safe answer. Treating the code book as the Bible is the safe way to do it, especially if you're down the org chart. And so I think that there need to be, and I've spent much of my career trying to create those kind of cultural shift where the community development department is there to help develop the community, not to stop the development of the community. So, you had mentioned, and I don't think you used the word ombudsman. I think it was Senator Guru that mentioned this. Forgive me if I'm remembering wrong who said it, but you didn't use the word ombudsman, but you talked about a state, or maybe it was the other chair that talked about, somewhere you could go to if you're having a problem with with the locality and kind of seek some relief, or at least get somebody to get involved in that. I don't think we'd have a again, depending on how it's organized, right, devil and anything else, but I don't think we'd have a problem having someone that was there to assist like that. In fact, we're happy as an organization if there's someone who's having an issue with one of our members, we're happy to get on the phone. We're limited, of course. Our members don't work for, our member cities don't work for us, we work for them. So we can't get on the phone and tell them what to do, but we can and have gotten on the line and tried to kind of help facilitate some solutions in different cases. So I would always would volunteer that. Again, I commend you for, it is frustrating. It is a frustratingly long process in some places. The building code kind of, to get a building permit submitted, getting back to your question or your observation, Mr. Barron, that the building code is complex, and it is hard for an average. I don't know if it's even possible for an average guy without some specialization to do that without getting professional help. I understand your frustration there. I do, I will say though, just to throw out it'd be one thing if we wanted to have a state code instead of an international code, but I mean, obviously the answer is not to throw out the code, because the code's there to ensure that buildings are made safe, and that when you sell it to someone else, they can buy it knowing that it met those codes.
Okay, anything more for the WAM report?
Mr. Chairman, Director Matthews has his hand up.
Oh, there, I see that. Brian, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, just quickly, a couple items I want to make sure that we get the correct information out. The code cycle for all of the codes as adopted in the state of Wyoming is a 3-year cycle. So we just adopted the 21. The next conversation would be in 2024. The discussion on lagging the code, the statute's very specific. Local municipalities have 6 months. So when the council works through that, the 21 code would come in effect 6 months after the council takes that. Lastly, for the local folks that have code issues or concerns, each municipality or county that adopts the code is required to establish a code board of appeals to hear that and work through some of those challenges. So just want to make sure that we had that out there, sir.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Anything else? Go ahead, Bob.
I have one question. When did we in Wyoming adopt codes? When was that started? Because there's a lot of Wyoming that apparently was built without codes, and even them old log cabins up there in the mountains are still standing. So I'm, you know, because we're going into this complexity of what we've built. I mean, when did we start with the building codes and stuff like that? Is there any history on that, or do we know? Just a question.
Go ahead, Brian.
Mr. Chairman, I can speak to the adoption of the international codes. That first edition was adopted in 2001.
Well, I can say that we've had certain types of building codes since I first started building things, and that was back in the 70s. And I'm sure it was well before that. They just kind of change over time and become more sophisticated, more professional, and not necessarily cheaper. Go ahead, Mark.
Mr. Chairman, I would also add that the other part of the building codes is you've got the planning department. So all of the zoning regulations are separate and apart from the building codes. But as an applicant for a building permit, I have to have the professionals who can work through that whole panoply of, it's a maze of legal requirements. And so we're not picking on just building codes or planning. It's getting that planning and the building together and meeting the expectations of both. Thank you.
Okay, anything else? All right, let's continue with our agenda. I think we're not going to go to committee directives at this point. Let's go to the Wyoming demographic data. Hank, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, members of the working group, Hank Oversland, LSO. I will be preparing item 3-01 in your packet today entitled Demographic and Housing Data, Wyoming, Surrounding States, and North Dakota. This was prepared this month in response to a directive by the co-chairman following the June 19th meeting of the entire task force, asking for some more information following the presentation by the Harvard Growth Lab and that their findings, some more data to kind of understand where the state of housing and employment in the state of Wyoming. So I'll go into that. I wanted to give reference to, this was done by the intern for the summer of LSO, Sam Alexander. He put this together. Unfortunately, he could not be here today. He's out on vacation. So I just wanted to publicly acknowledge him for putting that work together and thank him. Starting out on page 1 of the issue brief, this all has to do with state level demographic data. So first off, we looked at the total population of states. So this whole analysis looked at 8 states. That includes Wyoming, North Dakota, and Wyoming surrounding states. So those are Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Utah. When looking at this data, it's apparent, obviously, as we know, Wyoming is the smallest state by population in the union. and this is very apparent. Wyoming from 2010 to 2020, its growth rate in total population was only 2.32%, which is 3 times smaller than the next closest state in that time frame. That time frame is 2010 to 2020 again, which was Nebraska. Overall, it was the second smallest growth rate over the entire time frame, 2000 to 2022, and all others were 20% or greater besides Nebraska, again, which is smallest at 14.9%. Wyoming ended from 2000 to 2022. Obviously, this isn't a straight line, but was 17.7%. Moving on to page 2. As you can see, Wyoming is there at the bottom, and it has a fairly flat growth rate, acknowledging that the data, the y-axis is quite large. Wyoming had a fairly flat growth rate, which is shown in table 1 as well. Figure 1 shows this. As you can see, Colorado had a higher growth rate. Utah is starting to grow. And Idaho is catching up with the state of Nebraska, which had the smallest growth rate. Moving on to the working age population. The working age of a state, as defined in this issue brief, is the ages 15 to 64. And according to the U.S. Census Bureau data in table 2, Wyoming's working age population has declined since 2000. This may not be a steady decline, as you can see some growth there at the beginning, but overall since 2000, Wyoming's working age population has net decreased by 4.2%. Wyoming only has the 5th highest working age population behind Colorado, Utah, North Dakota, and Idaho. And this 4.2% decrease over the entire time frame of the data shown in table 2, which is 2000 to 2022, of 4.2% is the greatest. Only one state, Utah, saw growth over that time period, a net percentage increase of 0.6%. The same can be said for this growth between 2000 and 2020. Utah was the only state to grow in that time period. And as mentioned, figure 2 puts the data shown in table 2 into a graphic form that shows there was some initial growth in Wyoming from 2000 to about 2006, and then it has been a pretty steady decline since then. Looking at after that is the population percentage aged 65 and older. Many may consider this the retirement population. Wyoming currently has the 2nd largest population aged 65 and older, but in the time period of the table number 3 from 2000 to 2022, it had the highest growth rate, net percentage growth rate of the 8 states looked at. This was 6.9% over 22 years. And this growth since 2010 to 2022 was 6.1%. The next highest growth rate over that same time period was Montana, which is 5.1%. As you can see, the bottom 4 in that table, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Utah, ranged between 2% and 3.7%, while the top 4 states, Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, and Montana, grew from either 5.9% to 6.9%, which is Wyoming's number. This data is again shown in figure 3, which is page 4 of the issue brief. And it's very apparent that since 2010, there's been a steep increase in Wyoming, that purple line with diamonds, a steep increase since about 2009, 2010 of the percentage of Wyoming's population that is aged 65 and older. Moving down to the unemployment rate. As of 2022, Wyoming had the highest unemployment rate of the 8 states that were observed, and this is by greater than 0.5 percentage point. Since 2015, Wyoming has had either the highest or 2nd highest unemployment rate every year among the states observed. It was the 2nd highest in 2000. Then during the 2010 to around the 2009 recession, it was the fourth lowest. So it was right there in the middle of the pack. And then since 2015, it's been the highest or the second highest, as noted earlier. Since 2000, the net percentage change is the unemployment rate for the state of Wyoming has decreased by 0.2%, which is a good figure. The only state to have increased in that same time period is Colorado, which increased by 0.3%. Again, figure 4 on page 5 of the issue brief puts this over year by year. And as you can see, there was a great increase in every state between 2008 and 2009 due to that recession. Wyoming was in the middle of the pack, but not quite as low as South Dakota, Nebraska, or North Dakota, who fended off the unemployment rates a little bit better during that recession. Moving down to the bottom of page 5 of the issue brief, the St. Louis Federal Reserve economic data shown in table 5 shows that Wyoming's median household income has seen a net increase since 2000, and the same can be said for the 7 other states observed in this time period. Wyoming has the 6th highest median household income, ahead of only Montana and North Dakota. So in other words, that's the 3rd lowest. And since 2000, the growth rate of Wyoming's median household income is only greater than Colorado's. You can see that information on page 6 of the issue brief, which shows table 5 and figure 5. Between 2010 and 2020, every single state observed in total, their median household income grew. And the only states to have declined between 2020 and 2021 were Colorado and Utah. For wages, though, the story is a little bit different, as Wyoming's median annual wage has consistently grown since 2001, but it has consistently had one of the top 3 median wages of the observed states since 2001. So what we see in this data is that Wyoming's median wages are high compared to the states observed, but the median household income is pretty low. So that's a little bit of an anomaly. It also had the 3rd highest growth rate in median annual wage since 2001, between 2001 and 2022. And it only dropped one time in that time period, and that was between 2021 and 2022. The only 2 other states that had dropped in that time period are Nebraska and Utah, and that was between 2021 and 2022. After that year, between 2021 and 2022, though, those states both saw their median annual wage increase. So there was a consistent gain throughout with minor blips. Mr. Chairman, I can stop there or continue with the state level housing data if you'd like. I don't know what your preference is.
Yeah, let's do that, please.
Okay. Looking at page 8 of the issue brief, this is where we see the state level housing data. Towards the end of the issue brief, there is information on Wyoming specific, all 23 of Wyoming's counties to kind of pinpoint those issues. But statewide, the housing price index of Wyoming, Wyoming's housing price index has been the lowest of the 8 states in the last 7 years. And since 2000, Wyoming has one of the lowest 3 housing price index values. The housing price index value is defined by the Federal Housing Finance Agency as a weighted repeat sales index, meaning that it measures average price changes in repeat sales or refinancings on the same properties. So essentially, a higher housing price index means housing prices are rising in an area. Wyoming has the 6th highest growth rate, so it's a pretty low growth rate compared to the other states, and it's only ahead of the 2 Dakotas. Median home value, on that topic, Wyoming's median home value between 2010 and 2021 has grown, and the same can be said for the other 7 states. Wyoming currently ranks 5th among the observed states in median home value, ahead of the Dakotas and the state of Nebraska. But the growth rate of Wyoming's median home value since 2010 was the lowest when compared to the other states. So it's grown.
So Hank, sorry to interrupt you. The only real questions we have when we looked at this, I have, is what happens if we take Teton County out of the mix? I don't know if there's a way to do that, but I know that it's dramatic, because if you go back up to medium price index, my understanding is we're around 50 to 51,000 without Fremont County or without Teton County, and but we're up at around 58, 57 with. So it's, and that impacts our Medicare dollars substantially. And so I assume the same information holds true for house pricing and things like that.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would direct you. I don't have those exact numbers. I can get that done, but I would direct you to pages 12 and 13 of the issue brief, where we see Teton County on figures 11 and 12. Teton County's numbers blow, especially on median home value, they blow every other county out of the water. Their rent is a little bit closer to other counties, but it's still $1,402 a month. Their median gross monthly rent. So I think it definitely would. I would note though that these are median home values rather than, they're not averages. So that may still try and balance it out, but I think a difference could still be seen if Teton.
Mr. Co-Chair, is that a raised hand? I can't hear you.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Hank.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think that's all I have. The only two decreases we saw in table 8 was from Idaho between 2010 and 2015 and Utah between 2010 and 2015 in median home value. Otherwise, it seemed like there's pretty consistent increases. I think obviously we know that this data only began in 2010, so I think it would have been interesting to see a little bit more from prior to the recession, but essentially there was a lot of growth. Wyoming's was just a little bit. It didn't show as much growth as other states. As you can see, Colorado, Utah have seen pretty big growth, Idaho included in there. It's now surpassed Wyoming and Montana for median home value. So I think the growth since COVID is quite apparent in Idaho. On the median gross monthly rent, Wyoming currently also has the third lowest median gross monthly rent. Again, only higher than the Dakotas. And again, as with median home value, the growth rate over the time period of the table, 2010 to 2021 for Wyoming is the lowest. So that's something you can see in figure 9 on page 11. And then moving on to the county level data, there's population numbers. As you can see, we have a few big counties, Laramie and Natrona. Laramie County has grown over the time period. It saw the greatest growth from 2017 to 2021 at 5.46%. And the largest decline during that time period was Sublette County, which was at almost 11% or about 1,000 people. Sorry, the greatest was Lincoln County. Laramie County only grew by 2.78%. Teton County grew, Natrona County declined over the time period, and Sweetwater County declined. So you can see that in figure 10 on page 12 of the issue brief. Getting more into the topics though of this subcommittee, of this working group, the median home value in counties is shown in figure 11. Only Niobrara County and Weston County saw decreases in their median home values between 2017 and 2021. Largest growth was in Lincoln County at 24%. And other counties with large increases include Laramie County at 22.5%, Park County at 21.3%, Goshen County at 20.6%, Carbon County at over 19%, and Sheridan County over 19%, and Teton County at about 18%. The greatest average median home value was in Teton County, and this is at 800. This is that large number of $850,800, which is more than double the average of any other, double the median of any other county. So that kind of puts that into perspective. Gross monthly rent. Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, Hank. I think that if you put that in today's versus 2021, that would be off the graph. It'd be off the charts. It'd be up around 1.3 or 4. And everyone else would be up dramatically as much, but go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, when we get that data, we can forward that to you. Median gross monthly rent, 7 of the 23 counties saw decreases in median gross monthly rent between 2017 and 2021. The largest decline came in Lincoln County. So that's, interestingly enough, that was saw the highest increase in median home value, but the largest decline in median gross monthly rent. We kind of saw this flip also with Niobrara County, seeing a growth at 31.25% over the time period. But then we also saw Park County increase by over 25%, Platte County by 24%, and Teton County about mirrored what they did in home value, growing over the time period at 18%. Teton County's median gross monthly rent was $1,400 a month, coming in at an annual cost of about $17,000 for median gross monthly rent. When taking all of this data into consideration, the consistent trend seen is that Wyoming has seen less growth since 2000 and since 2010 than its surrounding states in North Dakota. And this is seen in 3 regards. First, Wyoming's population is trending older than its surrounding states. This decline in working age population, but increase in population percentage over 65 shows us that this is true. Wyoming also has the lowest overall population growth rate between 2010 and 2020. The second indicator is that compared to the 8 states observed, Wyoming's wages have grown quickly at the 3rd highest rate since 2000, but median household income has not quite done so. Low median household income generally makes it harder to afford homes, and it appears that high wages will be necessary to resolve this. But looking at Wyoming's comparatively higher unemployment rate, that could have be somewhat of an explaining factor. Third and final indicator is that Wyoming has had relatively little growth in most housing related metrics since 2010, which comes as the lowest median growth in median gross monthly rent, which can help offset lower median household income. And the same is true of having lower growth in its housing price index and median home values. So with that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my remarks on the issue brief, and I would stand for any questions.
Questions for Hank? So it's an interesting fact that when you have over the past 10 years, I think the number is only 13 counties have actually gained in population. And part of that gain is obviously for elderly. So then it begs the question, how long have we had a housing crisis or a housing shortage? And what did it consist of? Because we actually have less people in some ways and less employable people or working people than we did 10 years ago. And so I think these numbers are important to help us define what the issue really is and what the remedies are. It's just interesting to consider. Okay. Thank you, Hank. Appreciate that very much. Next, we've got, if there's no questions, Bob, go ahead.
You know, as you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, or co-chairman, you know, with the population and all this stuff, you know, what we see or what we're seeing over in our community is the lack of rental property that is being turned into these Airbnbs. How are those, they're gobbling up affordable housing, does that make sense? You know, at least in our community, and we're just a small community, but we're seeing homes that could be rented or owned by people that are being bought by outside investors for this Airbnb type of setup, and that is really, we were looking at the webpage over here in Cheyenne, and the Airbnbs for over Frontier Days went from 1,000 a night to almost 2,000 a night on these. It's phenomenal. So my question is, what are these, the influence of outside of the state buying up these real estate properties and turn them into these Airbnbs, what that is actually doing to our local economies as far as affordable housing?
It's a good question, Bob. I know that I've got a couple rental units, and I make more money on rent than I do on Airbnbs. So it kind of depends on where they're located and how often they're filled. But there's definitely a changing kaleidoscope of ownership and use of houses. Anyway, any other comments? Okay, seeing none. Next, let's go to our regulatory burden study. We got Matt and/or Ms. Defoe. I don't know, are they present or we're just, oh, there we go. No? Hank, do we have them presenting this or were they?
I believe Ms. Defoe is on the line. She just needs to unmute herself.
How about, can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, perfect. Can you see me okay?
Right.
Maybe, sorry, this system.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Well, good afternoon. I'm Jessie Defoe with Freedom Path 307. Unfortunately, Mr. Michael is not with me today, but may join me shortly. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to join the conversation today. Your question in the Subcommittee Housing Task Force is there a problem? And the answer is yes, there is a problem with housing supply. And we need to solve that in the Wyoming way, not any other place's way. We need to step back and ask the very simple question, is government in the way? If families have the very understandable and basic expectation or hope that their children can live in the same community or state that they grew up in, is government in the way of that? Right now, we can tell you the answer is yes. There are layers and layers of regulation that are in fact preventing families from being able to be in the same state or communities as their loved ones. Part of the problem is that we don't have housing inventory that is even somewhat inhabitable. That's a problem. We also don't have the ability to develop starter homes for our young people to come back and stay, or for the workforce that we very much hope will join our communities given the new jobs that are on the horizon. So what do we do about it? We need to get government out of the way. There are regulatory barriers and there are fees, some that are very extreme, and not just in Jackson, but especially in Jackson, that we're not even sure that the legislature authorized or intended. So this task force has a very important job, and we want to do what we can to make it simple with the research that we can provide. We have submitted a paper that I won't go into right now, but I hope you take time to look at. The paper shows just one snapshot, reminds you just one, of the kind of regulatory barriers that exist to develop a simple subdivision. What you need to know that on top of this are layers and layers of permitting fees, permitting delays, and permitting barriers that in fact are put up against the development of those starter homes. In Wyoming, we see many larger homes being developed and many people from outside coming in to buy those homes. That is due to an incentive for developers to develop larger lots because they can make more money. But that is because the regulatory and governmental barriers on small lots are so big that it discourages the investors from developing small lots because the costs are just too high and that they are not worth it for the starter homes. The current governmental and regulatory environment is set up in a way that smaller lot developers will make a lower margin due to those barriers. That's wrong. What we need for a graduate coming out of the University of Wyoming is a starter home, or at least an acceptable place to rent. Right now, we have inventories from the 60s and 70s that, frankly, most grandmothers wouldn't want their dear grandchildren living in. Let's fix that the Wyoming way. Let's look at what we're doing. If there's too much government, too many regulations, let's work to fix that. We think this legislative body at the Wyoming legislature, in fact, never authorized some of these fees that are happening now on the development of homes. We also encourage the adjustment on the ARU rules. And we think this legislature should look at whether some of these local governments, whom we all respect, have built a mousetrap of regulations that discourage investments of the kind of homes that we want our children to live in. We at Freedom Path are here to be part of that discussion and a Wyoming solution moving forward. Thank you for your time and the opportunity to draw attention to just one piece of the entire puzzle. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Questions?
Mr. Chairman, a question. Jesse, who is Freedom Path 307? What group? Just tell me about yourselves.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, thank you. We are a conservative policy think tank where we want to recognize that Wyoming is a pro-business state. We look to reduce regulatory burdens and do whatever we can to help Wyoming thrive in a conservative manner.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
So I'm curious, in terms of the cost of the process versus your 40% number, how do we know, or how would we determine, number one, what that 40% is, what it represents, and how that number was created? And number two, how what that number actually is in Wyoming?
Sure, that's a great question. In fact, I believe the 40% number that you're referring to is from a national study that came out basically stating for multis and different affordable housing options that is the regulatory costs come from that. And what we can also do is to work to delineate that exactly of what that would be within the Wyoming case. But I can tell you, as we started our research, we have been very, discouraged of, for instance, when we started this research, just to get the ball rolling to say, what are some of the pinch points in the housing market and where do we need to act first? We saw that coming to single family homes because the processes are not always transparent. And it's been alluded to here earlier today that even some of the permitting costs that you will see in these tables are not all inclusive. And when we call to find out that information, it's not necessarily transparent other fees and permitting barriers that are on top of that. And so I would just echo that while I cannot definitively say that 40% is also true for Wyoming, I believe that national study is very accurate. We could find out exactly where that compares to Wyoming, and that in fact, that is just as much of a problem here in our state as it is nationwide.
So any other questions? Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Jesse, and thank you and Matt for that very comprehensive report. I wanted to understand the expansive regulations on a home was really well articulated in your report. Is the mitigation rate that's in your report the current Jackson and Teton County? Does that entail the current Jackson and Teton County mitigation rates or the recently proposed mitigation rates, which are at minimum a doubling financially?
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Barron, thank you for that question. Our study, in fact, does not consider the mitigation fees that you are referring to, and I do understand that there are newly proposed rules. This is just strictly the permit for the 10-lot subdivision. When we called to do this research, just in full transparency, none of those mitigation fees were even mentioned. And we have found that not only in that county, but other counties, that the process is not always transparent in terms of all the different permitting rules, regulation, and barriers. And again, unless you have certain professionals such as lawyers and engineers helping you navigate the process, you wouldn't know about them. So I would say that this is very much a floor, not a ceiling, of what regulation costs that you will see in different counties.
So
Okay.
this might be a good opportunity, Mark, to explain to the working group what a mitigation fee is, because I don't think most people even aware that they exist, let alone what they are in Teton County.
Well, take a shot at it, Mr. Chairman. They continue to evolve and change, but mitigation started as a tool to include affordable workforce price housing back in the mid-90s, mid to late 90s in Teton County and the town of Jackson. They have evolved to the point where and a mitigation rate is a fee or the requirement to provide to the town and county housing department your ARU for them to manage. But it is a fee on a residential home. And starting at 0 square feet in the town of Jackson, if you finally get an inheritance and you can buy a city lot, or you get that city lot for an inheritance and you want to put up even an 800 square foot home for yourself, for your teacher, you have to pay mitigation. You have to pay this tax on the development of your home. And the nexus of that is that your home is creating the need for more employees in our community. There is also mitigation on restaurants. And I will say the new mitigation rates in Teton County are really going up, or proposed to go up considerably. A 60% rate on a 3,000 square foot home would cost a new homeowner $95,430. And it goes up from there considerably. A 5,000 square foot home likely assessed at a 70% rate at a cost of $185,000 plus. And then on top of that, we provide or require housing mitigation on non-residential, basically commercial development. And I'll just give you the latest proposal for retail, service, and restaurant mitigation, which is as high as $621 per square foot. Or you get a new lease, you get a new restaurant, you build it out, say it's a 3,250 square foot local establishment, your mitigation is proposed to exceed $2 million on that new establishment. So these are substantial fees. And the money goes into the housing department to operate, and goes into some of the town and county's new land acquisitions.
So do we know how much the towns and county collects in mitigation fees on an annual basis, Mark?
I don't off the top of my head, but I'm sure that's easily accessed. I think it's in excess of $2 million in 2022. But I think that can be checked with the town of Jackson and Teton County.
And then Mark, while we're at it, why don't you talk about some of the deed restricted and affordable housing requirements on lot development?
So we were very complicated. and it's been changing very fluidly, so I may not get this exactly correct, Mr. Chairman. But I will use the example of the new neighborhood, which is 225 acres of the Gill family and Lockhart family proposed residential development. The master plan, the neighborhood master plan, was approved by the county commission in July of 2022 at a 70% deed restriction requirement, which meant 70 dwelling units out of 100 dwelling units must be deed restricted, either affordable, which are based on median income, affordability, or employment. In other words, 75% of your earned income must be earned in Teton County, you must be a Teton County resident. There are many layers of affordability in there. And so that's one example of that's probably the newest residential development that's been proposed and in process in probably 30 years, I'm guessing. And so that's one example. But at the same time,
70% of the 220 acres has to be low income or affordable housing?
it was proposed and passed that 70% of the dwelling units on those 225 acres. In addition, you have park exactions, school exactions, roads, streets, all the water and sewer infrastructure would have to be put in by the developer as well. So it's a steep ask.
Amazing.
And I would say in an individual business and an individual home also must pay mitigation. So it's not just the large residential development proposition. It's the working family that finally, it's, you know, our family who finally got a city lot and built their own home, still had to pay the affordable housing mitigation on that.
So it would appear that, you know, Fremont or Teton County really has its own completely different issues and regulatory components that the rest of us can't even imagine, let alone afford. Go ahead, Cindy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Barron, for educating us all. I was kind of trying to get my arms around a little bit of that in preparation for this meeting, and I kind of thought that's what this was, but at the same time, I was really surprised that I thought certainly I'm missing something here. Now I know you're not an attorney, but I just was wondering if there's been any conversations within the community, or maybe this is something Mr. Frazier could help with WHAM as well. What is the town's statutory or legal authority to be imposing this? Is this kind of home rule that they can just kind of pass these regulations, or what, you know, what's kind of their position as far as the basis of doing this? If you know, if not, please don't worry about it, but just kind of curious.
So I would say, Cindy, that in the past, a comprehensive master plan has been done as a visioning document for the community or an area in the community. It's been done in 1994, was done in 2012, and updated since then. And in that visioning document, we've had housing studies, and the determination, or a legal study called a nexus study, has been provided or performed in the community over a matter of months, which measures median income and compares it to market price housing and affordability plateaus. And through that process, 5 elected officials in the town of Jackson will vote on a mitigation rate, and 5 elected officials for Teton County will vote on mitigation rates.
Basically, my question on that was just wondering, if this was something basically jurisdictional specific, or is this something perhaps through the development and use of the other comprehensive land use plans required by Title 18, if we can kind of see in additional jurisdictions throughout Wyoming as well.
Mr. Chairman.
Is that you, Mike?
It's me, Dave.
Fraser.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I just was going to comment. I'm unaware of any, and I'm certainly not prepared to tackle the legal question Cindy asked, but I'm unaware of any other communities or counties that this is taking place in. Well, I say I'm not, prepared to address those legal issues. I will say my hat's off to Jackson and Teton County who are dealing with this problem on such a greater scale than even the rest of us are. And I know they're just trying to do all that they can to try to bring some attainable housing to the county. I don't know if that horse is out of the barn or what, but not easy work they're doing over there. Thank you.
Mr. Co-Chair, if I might, I too, not going to try to answer for everything that Teton County does. I was a city councilman, was a county commissioner, just as Mark has been. In our time, we served together a bit of it. And, as far as the how and on these fees, all came with the same general statutory language that any fee structure in any community comes from. It's just in Jackson in Teton County, they have done these studies to say, what are the costs of development? And it's the same thing. Just like you have in Sheridan or anywhere else, the cost of development comes, you've got schools, you've got roads, you've got that they're asked for. In Teton County, they have just grown exponentially based on the need and the cost thereof. And as that's expanded, and in a county where 98% of the county can't be developed at all because it's owned by other governmental entities, then you just get into the classic supply and demand problem. So the prices go up, and the prices go up, cost of development goes up. And so the mitigation, those rates and all those other things keep going right up with it. The question becomes, when all of a sudden now is the dog wagging the tail or the tail wagging the dog? That's the problem that we're in right now. And that's the problem that we have to tackle. And I agree with what was said earlier, is that I think we've got two separate lists of problems. What's happening in Teton County, what's happening with the rest of the state. I say that though only because what's happening in Teton County now could very well happen in the rest of the state over time. And so we have to take a look at it. What's happening in Teton County is a preview of coming attractions in certain communities. And so we have to take a look at it the same. Also would disagree with the notion that just because you agree or disagree with these, that you're conservative or not. I'm a pretty liberal guy and I don't like any of this stuff that's happening. So, we'll blow your socks off on that one in just a minute when we get to what are we going to do about it. But but I think that all these things are done with, and I'll say this and get to it, but all these things are all done with just like the fire code. Everyone, the fire code and these mitigation rates and all these things are all done with the best of intentions. All done just like the report says. And the report from 307 is a very good report. I thought it was very, very, very well laid out. And I think it has some very specific relief points that I think should be looked at very, very seriously. But I do think that once again, these things are all done with the best of intentions. Sometimes, though, in different layers, in different areas. And I don't think sometimes, like I say, right hand, left hand, what's you're doing, or it just keeps continuing to a point. But it gets to a point now where it might be, well, like I say, we'll talk about it, but absurd, and we can go on with that. But I don't want to belabor it anymore. I want to try to get to the solution part. So I'll leave it there for now. But that's where this came from. I believe and I think it would be borne out that the city has the right to do these fees. And just the cost of, as a cost, just as any other community does.
Okay, go ahead, Cindy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly, I certainly didn't mean to imply that they didn't, Mr. Co-Chairman. I was just simply curious, like where we can examine, the kind of governing authority, perhaps, just to kind of familiarize as far as knowing that this is somewhat unique, for others to kind of be aware of or to be examining. And they're smart folks up in Teton County. I'm for sure they've done the legal research on this. I just wasn't sure if anyone knew, off the top of the head, kind of where we could learn a little bit more about this process. So just wanted to clarify that.
Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, just a follow-up question. Understanding, I think I heard that there may be as many as $2 million collected in 2022. What does the city or the county do with those funds? What do they actually expend those funds on?
So Mark, why don't you use the example of the recent 5 acres that was acquired where they're going to put low-income housing.
Right. So the first place is the operations expense of the Joint Town County Housing Department, which manages sales of the deed-restricted units, oversees the rentals of deed-restricted units, whether they're privately developed or publicly developed, and writes the rules and regulations and enforces those rules and regulations. Secondly, some of that money goes into the general fund for the town and county, and thereby gets to purchasing opportunities for the town and the county housing department. The example you're using, Bob, is the roughly 5 acres, currently an RV park it's the Virginian Motel RV park. It's on Snow King Avenue, very crowded back byway through town. And the town and the county housing department put in an offer that was accepted to purchase that for in the neighborhood of $28 million. And with financing that will probably exceed $32 million prior to being paid for. And some of the money for that also comes from a series of SPET ballot initiatives that aggregated an amount of $80 million that Jackson and Teton County taxpayers or Jackson and Teton County citizens recently approved on a number of ballot initiatives. So whether there's SPET initiatives, there's $80 million that's coming in, being collected from those SPET initiatives that can and will be spent on some form of deed-restricted affordable housing. And then there are the mitigation fees that are also spent in that manner. What's interesting to note is for all the tools, the well-intentioned, as the co-chair Mike Rue has said, well-intentioned, and I have voted for some of these, all of the tools, all the money that has been thrown at this, all the regulations requiring more and more deed-restricted units, we've at the same time really gone a great way to shut down free market home development. As I said earlier, the neighborhood plan would be, if it is passed, will be the next housing development that's of meaningful volume that would be passed since sometime in early 1990, maybe late 1980s. So private market home development for people working in our community is really, really tough to get past. And we're throwing a lot of tools and a lot of public money at the same time at government-built housing, deed-restricted housing.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else on? So we've got, I think the next up On the housing studies, Dave, are you going to do anything further on that? That's Dave Frazier.
Yeah, I was going to ask if I was the Dave you were talking to. I do have a PowerPoint which I can present. I would tell you, Mr. Chairman, that this is a housing survey, not a housing study. So if you wanted me to cook through it, I'd probably do so relatively quickly because I don't think anybody here needs to be convinced that there's a problem.
Sure, why don't you bring it up?
All righty. Can LSO bring that up for me, or should I try to share my screen?
You can share your screen now.
All right, let me give it a go. Am I,
It's thinking.
I am sharing my screen, it says. Can you see that? Housing
Yes.
crisis, Wyoming?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So this is a survey we did in May 6th. We sent out the survey in May 26th of 2022. So this data is about a year old, not as fresh as the last survey that we shared with you. We sent out to our 98 members, 41 responded. And you've got this in your packet as well. So I'll move through it pretty quickly. If you need me to slow down, please tell me. Again, here are the communities that responded. And the first question was, are you facing a housing shortage? And 90% said yes. What type of housing do you lack? 88% said they needed more affordable housing. 83% they needed workforce housing, and 63% said they needed housing for seniors. The question was that we asked the question, is current lack of workforce housing hindering your economic development efforts? And 70% said yes. They elaborated. Here's some elaborations. They had school teachers that couldn't find housing in Thane. An established business wanted to expand in Guernsey, but they didn't have any housing availability. Sundance just talks about how it's almost impossible to hire anybody. They have a whole list there because there's no rental properties available in the home or homes to buy. And I'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. Cokeville said we've got commercial business space, but nowhere to put the employees. And Cheyenne said we have a difficult time recruiting due to the lack of affordable housing. We asked, are there companies that like to expand into your community, expand or relocate to your community, but can't because of workforce housing? 60% said yes. So again, the point here is that it's not just a problem with people finding houses. This has a tremendous effect on the economies of the local communities and the ability to grow. I'm going to skip these. You can read them if you want to, just in the interest of time. We asked, do seniors currently have to move out? Seniors currently have to leave your community in order to find housing, and 56% of them said that they did. In fact, Labarge commented that they have to move as far away as Salt Lake City for that, and that, of course, is disappointing. As you know, many of our seniors born and raised in their communities, and so I'm sure they don't like to relocate, and obviously the families would cause family difficulties in terms of staying in touch with their loved ones. We asked, do you actually have trouble finding your own employees, your municipal employees, housing? And 63% said yes, they'd had trouble finding housing for their own employees. We had a Cokeville said we had a new police chief move in and had to live in a camper trailer. I will say that this is not the very camper trailer, but we put that picture in there for effect. Among others, 2 police officers that couldn't find housing, so they live outside of the community, and that's tough when they have to come in, on a call, especially in a small town. There's not a lot of backup, and so if your backup actually lives somewhere else, that's tough. Cody said that we extend a lot of offers that are rejected because folks can't find housing. Pinedale said we've offered a job for airport manager to 6 different parties who initially said yes and then had to decline because of housing. And Lingle said if we had required any of our folks to live inside of the community, it just would be a non-starter. We asked the question, have you made efforts to address this? 75% of the communities have said that they've made efforts to address this. Casper talks about working with the housing authority. Ranchester talks about trying to bring builders to town, but not able to do so. By the way, that's a side note. That's one of the, not really under the purview of this group, but one of the primary problems that we find is that a lot of our communities just don't have home builders. And the ones that are in nearby larger communities, it's hard to draw them in. I think I mentioned last time I spoke to you guys, an example I'd heard from my colleague in Oregon, where the town of Madras had waived all of their fees, development-related fees, in hopes of getting builders from the community 60 miles away of Bend to come in, and still none did. It's a really tough thing. And in fact, we had a comment from the city of Laramie at the time that we did this, that all of their builders that are usually in town were actually down in Colorado rebuilding after the fire in the Boulder area. So just the availability of folks to do the work is tough, not to mention their challenges in finding employees. City of Laramie, this is important to point out, I think, had been working through an extensive code revision in an attempt to bring additional housing development. And again, that kind of shows that they're, as much as, more than a year ago, we're working on the very things that you're talking about here, hoping that that will make an effect. And of course, it's really just going to be one facet of a very difficult problem, which requires a multifaceted solution. Out-of-state real estate investors and short-term rentals, they found to be a big, and that's been mentioned here. We have several communities that tell us that they have no long-term rental homes in their community because everything that would be available for that had been bought up and is being used as short-term rentals. And I'm not just talking about Jackson and Cody. We had that comment from 10 Sleep that there's no place for a family that wants to move into the community to rent because it's all on Airbnb and VRBO. I will mention that since this study, well, prior to this study, supply chain is also a big hindrance to building. And of course, since we did this study, interest rates have gone up so significantly that they've had a tremendously chilling effect on the market. We asked this question because we ask these kind of questions. If the legislature were to provide resources and/or funding to help address your housing issues, would you participate? And then not surprisingly, 90% of the communities said they would participate, but notably 46% that said that they have shovel-ready projects in their community if they had some resources, some additional resources. So again, we need the state's help. I'm not going to read all of those, but we need the state's help, and what help this group can be is important to the legislators on this task force. Again, I just mentioned that this is going to need a multifaceted solution, and we at WHAM, along with a lot of our sister organizations, some of whom you'll be hearing from today, continue to meet regularly, and we continue to try to brainstorm solutions that we'll be bringing to the legislature in addition to regulatory related solutions. With that, I just would point out that if you want to see the raw data from this, again, there's a link on the final page here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I moved through that pretty quickly. I'll be happy to take a little more time on anything else you want. Stand for questions.
Questions for Dave? If not, let's go to Dan.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman, and the workforce or the Working Housing Group. Dan Dorsch, Executive Director for Habitat for Humanity of Laramie County. I I believe I'm here just to answer questions and talk about our Cheyenne Affordable Housing Task Force final report that I mentioned at the meeting on June 19th. I also have Brenda Burkle from my front door. She was the chair of the Affordable Housing Task Force. So here to answer any questions and mainly just kind of talk through a few things. From our perspective, as far as the state regulation, a lot of it, from my view anyway, it needs to happen on a local level. And so the state can be a good voice to talk to other communities and municipalities to say, we recommend you do these zoning changes to allow for more density and things of that nature. And I'm more than happy to go into more detail on those. And like I said, in June, the Harvard Growth Lab report, our Cheyenne Affordable Housing Task Force report, and the Barriers to Attainable Housing report done by a Denver University engineering student made the same zoning recommendation changes. That would be to eliminate density maximums to allow more units for multifamily, eliminate the single family lot minimums on single family houses, eliminate the 20-foot setback rule, rear setback rule, eliminate the 3-story height restrictions on new multifamily development that we have here in Cheyenne. And these are Cheyenne specific. Not every community is going to have the same, but and then one thing here in Cheyenne that we have is a 30% requirement on multifamily units for 30% of your materials have to be brick and stone on multifamily, and that it just adds cost to the development, and it's purely an aesthetic thing. It adds no structural integrity or anything like that. It's purely for looks. And so the Cheyenne Affordable Housing Task Force made those recommendations to the city council back in October. Our planning department is in the process of currently writing those up to change our UDC to allow for more density in our codes. For instance, right now, if somebody had 20,000 square feet of land that they wanted to put apartments on, they have to use a multiplier of 1,600 square feet, which 20,000 divided by 1,600 gives you 12 and a half. That's the amount of units they can put on that 20,000 square land. Even if they wanted to do smaller efficiency apartments, say 600 square feet, they could still only do 12 and a half. And so by eliminating that density maximum, it allows to maximize use of land within city limits. It'll also help communities build up instead of build out, because as we know, going out, you have to have the land to do it. You have to have the infrastructure in place and things of that nature, which adds cost to development. So if we're making zoning recommendations that are making it easier to utilize infill already, it lowers costs and adds units. We've already kind of touched on one of the other things as far as the state level, and that's streamlining the licensing process for contractors. Dave from WHAM mentioned that, so that was something we would agree with as well. And even if it's streamlining it, making it more accessible for contractors to be licensed in multiple cities to maybe make it easier for them to travel to go do other jobs, as we've heard that some cities don't have the builders. And another thing that the legislature could do would be to not necessarily reduce regulation, but just give the counties options for other things. For instance, the county optional real estate transfer tax, which I know isn't very popular, but for the legislature to at least allow the counties to figure out for themselves if they wanted to add this tax. And the reason I use that as an example is because a lot of states across the nation use real estate transfer taxes to fund housing projects and affordable housing projects and trust funds. For example, the state of Ohio, I believe it was in 2021, had $55 million for their housing fund on transfer taxes alone. Iowa was 7 million. Kentucky uses it as well. So there's the regulation reduction, to at least for me, is more on a local level, and the state could be a good voice to encourage communities to do that. Even maybe find ways to incentivize cities for changing their zoning codes to make housing more available. So with that, I will stand for any questions.
Any questions for Dan on affordable housing? It's a great report, by the way.
I do, Mr. Co-Chairman, I do have one, and I'm trying to look at I don't think the numbers or pages are numbered, so I can't, I'm trying to scroll down to it, but oh shoot, now I lost it. Here we go. On recommendations in your first report, it's skips down to number 7. And it says create and maintain affordable housing office charged with at a minimum, A, developing a housing authority strategy to ensure long-term sustainability. And then it goes through a bunch of others. And I'm not going to read them all. And this is no knock on you, Dan, this because it is a great report. It's not a great report. But I just want everyone to know, if you look at number 7, you will see word for word exactly what Teton County proposed 25 years ago that led us to the fee structure we have today. I mean, it was, matter of fact, I remember it quite clearly. It's beautiful. It's beautifully written, and it's exactly the same. And so it's one of those, if you want to take it and put it on steroids, that's how we got to where we got in large measure. Like I say, best of intentions. Absolutely couldn't agree with it more. But it's just like I say, when you just start adding it on, adding, it can get there. And so, like I say, I'm with you. I am. And like I say, we'll get to it when we get to solutions, but I do appreciate the report.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I would like to point out that we are in the process right now of finalizing a draft to go before our city council to create a fee waiver program for affordable housing projects. So that would remove building permit fees for anything that is deemed affordable or income restricted, as our planning department likes to call it. And so there would be, it's not an inclusion, we're not looking at inclusionary zoning or anything like that, but getting rid of those fees is something our task force is looking at. We're also, the TAP fee deferral program, as most of you are aware, I think the average here in Cheyenne is about $25,000 per unit for TAP fees. So if a developer is wanting to do a larger project, that's a large amount of cash up front that they have to pay those TAP fees. And so what this would do is would be in coordination with our Board of Public Utilities to allow developers to delay or defer those costs of fees over time until time of CO. So it's more of a cash flow issue to help with those upfront costs. And so we understand the phrase I sometimes use is one person's incentive is another person's penalty, right? That you're going to what the best intentions, right? So we put a lot of thought into this report, and we don't want to add burden. We're trying to relieve that burden through some of these solutions.
Yeah, I like the support Medicaid expansion suggestion.
I didn't touch that one. Ms. Brickell has one for us as a question or comment.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to add to, it was such an honor to serve as the chair for that committee, and thank you, Dan, for presenting the final report so eloquently. I also wanted to add that I would encourage thinking on the state level in terms of streamlining, not only to just to clarify maybe some of the language, but also to ensure that the policies and procedures that are housed then with the Secretary of State and some of those folks and can be interpreted are being interpreted and applied kind of uniformly and fairly, and making sure that the state statutes align with policy and procedure can be absolutely a streamlining effect that can have a downstream benefit. The other thing I would ask is that the committee consider enabling language for things like land banking as an example. While there's not really a cost at the state level, it's strictly enabling language. It does most of is in keeping with the same spirit that Dan mentioned, allowing the counties and municipalities then to choose. They can enter into those interagency agreements, or they can let them pass by, certainly up to them. And the other thing that we have heard, Dan and I both, on a national level and best practices amongst other states, is to think about defining the problem. Right? Really drilling down and making the defining statement as the problem we're trying to solve, and making sure that that is able then to clearly define specific solutions and remedies. That's all I have.
Okay, any follow-up questions on that? So I'm just curious, I can't remember the numbers, but my understanding is in Cheyenne, we're building or at least permitting over 1,000 units per year. And based upon your studies, I mean, how long at that rate till we catch up? Assuming we can develop 1,000 units per year.
Well, I would qualify that by saying there is a difference between what type of units they're developing. Not all of them are affordable. Some of them are most decidedly unaffordable for much of the workforce. So, on average around the state, if we are developing 250 affordable units per year, that doesn't even make a dent. We are roughly overall about 4,000 units short in Laramie County. And, presumably if our population ticks up with much of the good work that the Business Council Cheyenne leads and the Chamber are doing to bolster our economy, I think we're always going to be, we're never going to get ahead. We're never going to meet our need, really, and we're certainly never going to be getting ahead. I would certainly defer also to Dan if he has a different perspective.
I would just just say the same thing. A lot of those units aren't their market rate, which is needed, but it doesn't cover the whole need, the whole spectrum of housing that we need. We need everything from, the current numbers we're hearing here in Cheyenne Housing Authority, which represents more than Cheyenne, but 1,800 people on the waiting list for affordable housing. So that's 0 to 50% of the AMI. Then there's a large need for 50 to 80% of the AMI, or what we typically deem as workforce housing. So yes, units are being developed, but it's not covering the whole spectrum. And then there are some units that could be developed that are being shut down in the planning or in the process of being approved due to NIMBYism or not in my backyard. And I think that's when somebody touched on it earlier. I think it might have been Dave from WHAM, that maybe something else the state can do is be that education piece for the population to say, we need these, the housing is important. Here's why it's important. And we as citizens and neighbors of Wyoming should be coming together to say, yes, we need housing here and welcome it. So that would be my final push, or my final thought for something the state may be able to do as well. Thank you.
You bet. Any other questions? All right. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's everything we had in terms of presentations and information that on the agenda today. So why don't we take about a 5-minute break, because we've been going for a while. 10-minute break, and let's come back at 3:57, and we'll talk about committee directives and where we go from here. Does that work for everybody?
Sounds good, Mr. Co-Chair.
Okay, are we all back in town?
Yes, sir.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, next I'd like to open this up to kind of just a round robin discussion on people's thoughts, ideas, and potential further topics that we can that you recommend we might delve into through using our LSO or other resources around us, and probably kind of at some point we need to prioritize or categorize different things to think about what we can do now, what we can do in the near term and midterm and long term. So with that, let me just open up the floor and please just jump right in. Dave, you got your, Bob, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I guess we seem to be talking about a lot of topics here, from regulations to, and I'm confused on the housing a little bit. Is it entry-level housing that we're looking to build here? Workforce housing, is it affordable housing for, which housing are we looking at? I guess is a big question to me. If it's workforce housing that we're trying to deal with, or is it entry-level housing for our young people in Wyoming, or is it based on their wages? There's a lot of things that are kind of sketchy around here. I agree that on the regulations, we need to do something very dearly with that. That seems to be the stickler on everybody's point going across here. But I'm still confused on which area that we want to concentrate on the housing.
I think it's a good question, Bob. Our focus is probably not just affordable housing and workforce housing, and it's even rental units. I mean, that's the component that drives the mitigation concepts in Teton County. If you look at Lander, the rents in Lander are out of this roof, so people would have to rent, commute from Hudson, from Riverton, from Shoshone, so because there's no available housing. And so, but you're right, and part of the problem of this topic in and of itself is it's just an ungangly mess. And there are no easy solutions to it or simple ones. But ultimately, all of those things that we just talked about go back to what can we do from a regulatory standpoint to help fix it or mitigate the problem.
Well, let's do away with regulations all the way, and then we've fixed that problem, right?
That's a true story.
And as far as the state getting involved down to the county level with the zoning, all those are elected official spots, so are we going to try and supersede the voters of those areas? Is a question I have also.
Well, and that's one of the issues that I took some notes on, and I think, and Cindy brought this up early on, and that is, what laws are we talking about? What authority does the city and the county have, and the home rule laws that we have? And so I think at a minimum, I'd like to have LSO put together a 101 on local government law, particularly in Wyoming. And Hank, there are a few. I think I've looked at about 4 or 5 of the key cases out there that kind of outline what it is, and I think that there's a couple, like a Hornbook kind of outline of what their authority is, how far they can reach, and where those boundaries are or can be. But I can say that from a 20,000 foot level, the authority of home rule is granted basically by the legislature to local governments. And so if we feel that legislative action is necessary because of excessive regulations on the local or county levels, the legislature has the ability to curtail that, or to modify it, or to put guideposts up. So that, and certain restrictions types things. For example, take the code requirements. We could very easily pass a code that says that you can't have building or construction codes that exceed the current codes that have been adopted. We could even direct them back to a prior code if we wanted to. So we have the ability to do things like that, just as an example.
You know, I guess a question for Mark is, what would help up there in Jackson to push back against this overburdensome, you know, and very costly things that are going on up there?
That's the question of the day. And as Senator Guru, Co-Chair Guru mentioned, we've been working for decades to achieve meaningful, lasting solutions. And despite our best efforts, we've made it more expensive for working families to live in Jackson Hole. And we've increased our commuters, our workforce out of our community into other communities in the many thousands per day. I'm not a legislator. I really wanted to present what's going on in Jackson and Teton County in a bare-fact manner. And because, as Senator Guru said, what's happening in Teton County is coming to a community near you.
Go ahead, Cindy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To kind of build upon your remarks, if LSO would be so kind to also provide us with some assistance related to impact assistance, in the cases around that. I've worked on impact assistance for years, and the theory that I received a text about is something I'd sure like a little bit closer into, but as far as the justification for these fees, road use agreements, we've impact assistance in tangible ways is something that, is contemplated in the statutes. And so I think as we are looking at our government authority primer, maybe having a primer as well on impact fees and mitigation fees would also dovetail nicely with that. In addition, I also really keep, kind of trying to get my arms around. I'd like, this isn't necessarily a research request, but, maybe again, more time with our state fire council, trying to get our arms around the rationale on why we've gone to the maximum by adopting these international codes that are just so costly for small communities and small business people in rural Wyoming. Mr. Barron made an excellent point, and it's something I see all the time, is that people just simply, entrepreneurs, business people trying to build a house, they can't even afford to get the help necessarily to fill out the application. And it's really for many, and just trying to take a look at, is there a way that we can have that balance of protecting public health and safety, but not having to hire professional contractors, whether that be attorneys, engineers, architects, environmental consultants, just to fill out a paperwork to get a permit. So this fire code is really, again, as I said, that's kind of a statewide discussion that I think, looking at what other states have done, if every state has adopted, or Mr. Frazier had some experience with his time in another jurisdiction, there has to be a solution to make this a little bit more workable. So if there's the opportunity to examine, how other states or other jurisdictions similarly approaching that delivery, that would be helpful.
So Cindy, I mean, there's a couple different components to that. You know, we're talking about essentially 7 different codes, and not just fire prevention. And so that's an awful broad topic. I'm just trying to figure out a constructive way to get what we're looking at. I mean, the primary codes that impact the everyday folks would be your uniform building code. And after that, I presume, I mean, the electrical, the only problem, there are different issues with that, but I think the building code is the greatest impact by far of all those combined. Do you have an opinion on that, or do you?
I see Representative Davis has his hand up, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to yield to him and then respond.
Sure.
I think Cindy has nailed something right there on the head with the fire enforcement. You know, the city of Cheyenne has paid firefighters. The other 80% of Wyoming has volunteer firefighters. So the rural parts of Wyoming cannot meet those standards that are being enforced in Cheyenne. We have a lack of manpower to even address the fire. You know, so there's something, there's got to be a trade-off in here, like she's saying, for the areas that we live in and the things that we are demanding that can't be delivered in rural Wyoming. It can only be delivered in these other urban areas.
Well, Bob, I think we're mixing a little bit of apples and oranges there. The fire department and the paid firefighters, all they do is put out fires. They don't deal with codes or any of that type of responsibilities. And that there are 8 different communities that have professional firefighters around the state of Wyoming. But I think that trying to narrow down what you're saying is that for small towns, and those towns that population study that we had earlier today, so a lot of those small towns are actually losing population right now. And in part because the homes that are there are so dilapidated that there's not much left, nor do they have the tax base to cover it. The housing in those facilities, and they don't have the workforce. And as our energy industry declines over time based upon our new anti-coal, anti-oil, and anti-gas world, that there's only one direction that those folks can go unless we find some other alternatives for them. But it's that's even a bigger problem than what we got in front of us today. So who's out there that hasn't said anything today that we can get some new input? I see Kelly Lockhart's name on there. Kelly, you got any suggestions or comments so far on what we've done today? If you're around. And if not, Ivy, would you want to care to jump in?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. I think the only thing that I have that I'd like to add at this point, and this goes back to the conversation that was just a few minutes ago, but one of the things that we really struggle with when we have this broader conversation is what is affordable housing? And that it might be beneficial, especially for this group, if we could make that, determine what that definition is, so that we are applying it universally whenever we have conversations related to housing affordability. I don't have anything else, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
So that's an interesting question, and obviously it's different in Teton County than it is other places. And as you look at the information that we've been presented to us, affordable housing and workforce housing tend to be piggyback to each other. There might be a different grade, something a little bit lower for affordable versus workforce, versus low income. But I think it's probably a useful thing to have to take some of the information that has been presented to us and to figure out, because we know what cost per square foot is around Wyoming to some degree. We know what the average wage is around Wyoming, so we can figure out what affordable is. And then we have geopolitical data that kind of shows us our makeup in terms of workforce versus elderly versus the low income that simply can't afford anything other than low income. And so just to have a schematic that outlines what those are, I think LSO could probably put that together in a chart so that the next time we meet, we can kind of review that to help kind of have a consensus so that when we use that terminology, we're all talking about the same thing. That makes a lot of sense. So Kelly, I see you joined us via picture. So good to see you. How are you?
Good to see you, Mr. Co-Chair. I had not intended on saying anything today, but since you offered, I'm not a especially bashful guy, as your other co-chair knows. My comments, I guess, will be that it's taken decades for Teton County to get to where it is. And the presumption through those decades has always been that the government could solve it better than the private sector. And that has been an abysmal failure. And the best way to allocate the scarce resource, whether it's land, labor, capital, is the private sector. And so the scarcity that Teton County created over these decades has led to the shortages that we have. And there have been several really good questions today by thoughtful members of your committee. And it always, or a lot of them kind of get down to, well, how do we solve this particular problem or that particular problem? And my view is anything that the state legislature could do to get out of the way of the private sector would be helpful. I think that the legislature could also be helpful in terms of these impact fees or infrastructure fees. You have money available, and that would be helpful in order to help the private sector to create these houses. There was a question about these fees and about mitigation, and I'm not an attorney, but some of you recall that I did ask the question in 2018 with a bill that actually asked the legislature to look at housing mitigation. Because as I understand it, home rule on a particular document that I have on page 7 says that the legislature does not intend for local home rule to collect taxes or fees. I mean, just as you wouldn't allow a county to impose an income tax, your home rule statute kind of says, look, you have to operate within these bounds. So the particular item or the particular report that I have on home rule kind of questions that authority. And again, I'm not a lawyer. No one's tested it. I think it would be a conversation that you legitimately should have in terms of how these fees are imposed at the local level. So I think there are some things that you can do, and I think that you have a role The reason you have a role is because of the goal of the state of Wyoming. And most people believe in the same goal. I noticed an MBA deck that the university forwarded on to me, and there it was: broaden the tax base, diversify the economy, and broaden the tax base. As long as we're all working toward that goal, we'll be successful. But if the state and if the educational institutions and the local communities are not all moving in the same direction, it becomes difficult. And if you're imposing these rules and regulations that force people to not be able to house their employees, or as Mr. Barron mentioned, you're adding an additional cost to open a restaurant in Jackson of $600 a square foot, that capital is going to go someplace else. So that doesn't help the state in diversifying the economy and broadening the tax base. So sorry, my comments were a little bit disjointed today. I was going to save them for your meeting in Lander, but thank you for Mr. Co-Chair for your time, and thank you all for all your efforts. I know that you understand the importance of the issues before you today.
Well, appreciate your comments.
Mr. Co-Chair?
Go ahead.
Thanks. Wanted to speak after my good friend Kelly. Kelly and I agree on a lot of things. Although there are a couple things we don't agree on, and the fact that our housing program and some of our programs in Teton County have been a dismal failure is one of them. I was involved in the first affordable housing project in Teton County, and I was very proud of it, still am. I think that government can and has, and even he mentioned as part of the incentive programs and things, government can be a part of the solution. But I do also know that when I started my business in 1980, in Jackson, I paid $50 for a conditional use permit and a $25 business fee, and I started in business. Today, to start that same business from scratch, like I did then, would cost over $2 million in city fees alone. So has it gotten out of hand? Yeah. Is it all working? I'd like to maybe have an opportunity to hear the other side from the folks who are imposing those fees or want to, or are working on those, to maybe have a chance to talk about why they're doing what they're doing and maybe hear some of their rationales for doing it. Maybe we'll agree with them, maybe we won't. But the overarching view for me is that Teton County's got one set of problems. And while they're a preview of what could be in Wyoming, I think that we maybe should put those on one side of the table for now and then look at maybe the other side. And I think it's a really good question to ask about what is affordable housing versus attainable housing versus starter housing versus senior housing. And they are different things to a certain extent, but I also wonder sometimes that if maybe we didn't try a simpler solution, and I'm just going to throw it out there and just say, everybody can shoot at it and say how wrong it is. But even if we were to say across statewide, especially in our cities and towns, this is what it had the most effect on. If you have a city lot that was over a certain square footage, whether it's 7,500 square foot lot or whatever a standard city lot is across the state, say you had less than 40% coverage on your building, that you could come in and get a permit and get an accessory unit, or virtually just walking up to the counter and getting it, and try to see if our cities and towns and the counties as well would like to participate in such a program and to try to help citizens be able to put an accessory unit on their lot very easily and simply. In addition, maybe we could even talk to some builders of prefab homes to say maybe we could spec out something that does meet fire code, building code, electrical code, all those codes, that is a pre-made unit that could be put on there to help. That could be a senior home. It could be a home for an employee. or the folks could rent out to employees and provide a quality but affordable for them and affordable to rent out unit across the board. Would it require cities and towns to take a good hard look at their zoning and planning? Yeah. But that might be something that could kind of help jumpstart what I think is kind of what I've heard, all the conversations I've heard about this, the lack of housing across the state. Put Teton County aside for a second, but the rest of the state, it's a clear and present danger to our economic vitality and to our economic future, and that we need to do something to try to address it. In addition, when I read all these reports, I think about how could we help. I think about things like with some of these codes and some of these costs of building, that maybe we could put together a fund at the state level where builders could access the fund, not unlike the leaky underground storage, the LUST account, where we have a fund set up where people could draw on the fund to put in that sprinkler system for a multi-unit apartment complex, and then pay it back when the units become 95% occupied. As another way to help maybe developers buy down some of that upfront cost that may be preventing them from building today. But those are just some of the things that come to my head. I heard Representative Davis when he talked about and others talk about kind of Airbnbs and what the problem is with them. I agree, but a lot of folks would tell you, and Mark Barron, I know, will agree with me on this one. Our city is banned or as close to banning them in a lot of areas as possible. And a lot of folks feel like that's a taking in and of itself. But that too is discouraging them from renting out their home and helping pay their taxes or doing things like that. So I would tread lightly in some of those areas because we might end up creating another problem more than we're solving. But those are some of the ideas I had. I'd like to hear from folks in Teton County who are on the other side of this rate structure picture and hear what they have to say. Not that I'm going to agree with all of them, because I don't, but or just to get an understanding of where it is they're coming from on some of this, and then see where we go from there with that. But the rest of the state, to try to come up with something to try to move forward, and just like I say, even if they come back, if the cities and towns come back and say there's no way we can do that, Mike, well, okay, but at least we tried, or at least asked for something. That's what I like, Mr. Chairman. Thanks.
So Mike Martin, you got any thoughts or particularly
I
around?
do, thank you. I think there's a number of things. The governor recently added me to the task force. I'm the chairman of the board for the Wyoming Community Development Authority. We as an organization are working on a number of initiatives, some with Dan and Brenda and others across the state, to include the possibility of trying to start a prison-built housing program to create affordable units to go onto lots. The question, and I think some of the struggles are tied to the affordability of getting the land itself. Mr. Barron, you pointed out what an old RV park costs in your area, which is different than the rest of the state. But Scott Hoversland, who happens to be Hank's father, is the executive director of WCDA. He was recently at a statewide or a nationwide conference of executive directors of housing authorities, and Cheryl Cohen, who's the executive director of Montana Housing, has sent along an email that outlines 8 separate bills that went through the Montana legislature. And thanks to you, Fire Marshal Matthews, for that article. That summarizes some of it, but I'm going to forward this email to Hank so that it'll help, I think, the LSO digest how to maybe break down what some of those regulatory reductions might look like. The bills, one of them is very long, but the others are 4 and 5 pages long. And it talks about establish that childcare is a residential use of property. That was something that the legislature felt the need to step over the municipalities on. Allow for the zoning of tiny dwelling units was another. Revised municipal zoning to allow multifamily and mixed-use development. That must have been a problem there. But revised zoning laws related to ADUs, and obviously, Co-Chairman Guru, that's a challenge certainly in your part of the state. You know, I grew up in a small town in Wyoming and happen to live in Cheyenne now, and I've developed real estate in parts of Wyoming, and hearkening back to the Harvard Growth Lab report, parts of it that I can get on board with and parts of it that I struggle a little bit, but you got to remember their focus was on economic development, not just housing for housing's sake. And when they talk about the challenges that are there, and I'll say urbanizing parts of Wyoming, we all know that that's only feasible in a few areas, but they are correct in looking at what a vetocratic environment looks like in a municipality. And one developer screws it up for everybody else. And so trying to get more density onto properties, you have a few neighboring landowners that speak up, and I'll call them the vocal minority in a lot of cases, not always. And the silent majority lays low, and it requires much more time, much more effort, and much more cost to try to ultimately get an affordable front door that might sit on that piece of ground. So one thing that it's at the end of the agenda that I'd ask be put on there is WCDA is going to be funding a statewide needs assessment, and my passion is for it to be 23 chapters at least, with discussions about branching out to the other municipalities within those 23 counties. We'll also be looking to get some support, whether it be from organizations such as WHAM or the County Commissioners Association, potentially from the legislature or the governor's office, to do a statewide housing plan or strategic plan. States near us, like Nebraska, like New Mexico, have done that, and it really, I think, helps the policymakers that many on this task force are, to find the path forward. And it's not just a report to go on a shelf, but it's really one to try to provide some guidance and some forward direction as to what the 5 and 10 year plan might be. Stepping off that just a little bit and looking more towards what regulatory reduction looks like, stepping on the municipalities and the county's toes is not something that I want to suggest broadly, but the ability to reduce regulation to allow for developers to have the confidence to come into a community and want to put up more than 5 or 10 or 12 is lacking. And in a community like Gillette, they have affordable or buildable lots there, and no builder will come to town. And part of that could be uncertainty over the future of those fossil fuels that are extracted up there. But some of it may be from we just don't know if it's worth it, especially with the interest rates where they're at, especially with long build times and some supply chain disruptions. There's a lack of confidence for builders to come into the state and do anything meaningful, so that there would be, the story that I grew up with was you buy your first home, and then eventually you may get married or have some kids and you outgrow it and you move to the next one. And Airbnb and some of those disruptions are part of that. But that chain is really lacking, and to try to get back to what that looks like, so that there is move chains or the filtration of one from a small house to the next. Landlords are great, and I heard you, Co-Chairman Nicholas, say you own some properties. That's great. We need rental units because not everybody is honestly qualified or capable of owning a house. But those are just a few that come from my seat on the board at WCDA. Sorry to be long-winded. I think there's a lot of opportunities on the regulatory side, but there's also some other exciting things that we're looking at the authority.
Okay, anybody else? Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, I have just one other thing to throw in here. With this development in a lot of these communities across the state of Wyoming, we have limited resources, water and sewage, So if we develop these, there are going to be associated issues with delivering municipal water and taking away the sewage. And then also there's the other resource, natural gas. You know, a lot of these communities in Wyoming do not have natural gas, you know, that's clean and affordable. How can we look at some of that type of stuff? I don't know where you draw the line, but whenever there's an action like this, there's got to be, for instance, our small community over there, if there was a 30 housing boom, 30 homes built, they don't have a significant water infrastructure to even handle that. You know, so this is going to be something, you know, even up there in the Gillette, they're piping water 30, 40 miles away from the Madison Formation to supply the community of Gillette up there. So we need to look at other issues also with the development of this affordable housing.
I think that costs the state around 220 million to help assist in getting that water line built, which in today's money would be close to 500 million probably.
Yeah.
Okay, who else would like to chime in? Somebody. Mark, any specifics or short-term fixes that you think would send us in the right direction?
Well, I think it's clear that in Jackson and Teton County, we have overregulated the private sector in our pursuit of public housing. And I definitely think that has to be re-examined, and don't think that was an intended outcome, but it is certainly where we are. We're also taxing the very people who we say we want in our community, our middle class, between property taxes and other regulations, are just being financially nudged out of our community at a ridiculous pace. And I'm sure Mike hears it as much as I hear it from people who are just very frustrated with their ability to keep up with their housing taxes bills. So housing affordability has to be maintained by the middle class. We're providing the economic foundation in this community, as well as the incoming workforce and, you know, our teachers and our medical and et cetera. I think we tend to skew in our community everything as an emanating factor from tourism and from the result of not having enough, because 97, 98% of our lands are federal lands. We just don't have enough land. Yet we continue to push and impose more and more expense and regulations onto that single family starter home and making it next to impossible for them to get a toehold here.
Jeremiah?
And Mr. Chairman, I just want to say that that phenomenon I'm talking about is not exclusive to Jackson and Teton County. It's a Wyoming phenomenon.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to say a couple things quickly. As much as we talk about the regulation, and we're very happy to continue that dialogue and continue to gather information, I do think some of these things are going to require some incentives. And I'm not just suggesting dollar incentives, but some of those can be statutory incentives that you all can put in place as a legislative body. We'll try and be productive in bringing forward those concepts and in ensuring that the full slate of options are explored here. I'd also just echo what the co-chairman mentioned. Do think it would be valuable to hear from the other side, to hear from the local governments about the pressures that they have. These aren't elected officials that are just coming into place saying, we want to put our thumb on this. The local constituency really is active in some of these areas and wants to see certain regulatory regimes in place. And it's valuable to hear that information and understand that dynamic in this equation. And I'll be happy to help arrange for county officials from various counties to participate in that conversation. Again, appreciate the time today. We want to be active and productive participants.
And by the way, Chad, just so you know, when we met in June, and part of the input that Chief Perkins talked about was, and he went through a couple of examples of ways that the state can incentivize through SLIB, through business loans, those type of things. That you know, if they do certain things or comply with certain housing requirements, or so, I would suggest it might be useful if you talk with Drew about that and come up with a couple of any ideas that and so what I'm going to do is ask for everyone that's on this working group for the things that we've talked about today, put it in an email form, your kind of a tentative proposals or suggestions, and send them to Senator Garou and I. I'm going to give you a little list of the ones that I've started, and you can add to or think about them. The first one was what I talked about earlier at the outset, and Hank, I want you to kind of focus on this a little bit. What I'd like to do is create a website so property owners plus city councilmen plus county commissioners can chime in on all of these topics, and so we can get input from everybody. And we'll kind of outline what some of the topics are and what their concerns are. And Jeremiah, you and Dan can kind of spread the word amongst the cities and towns that we want their input on how this all works, and Cindy as well. Let's talk about potential legislation. Hank, I'd like you to put together kind of a synopsis and probably copies of the state of Montana bills, because I read that same article, and there's a few of those that kind of make a lot of sense. One of those would dovetail in very nicely with Senator Garou's suggestion of an ADU or an ARU provision that and kind of figure out what kind of parameters we can put on it in terms of creating laws that basically allow or direct communities that in certain situations homeowners have that. And so then let's go back to that little worksheet on home rule. I'd like you to chase down a little bit what Mr. Lockhart talked about because normally when home rule gets challenged, it's always a balance of interest analysis when that happens. And when that interest becomes too great on the home rule side, it becomes an indirect taking at a minimum. And clearly, Teton County is verging very far into that gray zone. And frankly, I'm surprised there hasn't been a lawsuit brought against in Teton County at this point, but it's going to happen sooner or later. But I'd like to know what the general background law is on that and what constitutes a taking in terms of home rule. If they're taking 70% of their land development, or 70 out of 100 units, and saying you're going to build this at a set price for workforce services or low-income housing, they're probably giving up hundreds of millions of dollars on any substantial development over time. And if that's not a taking, I don't know what is. So I think it'd be useful to kind of walk down that a little bit. And so that's just kind of a personal property rights component, and then also oversight of the state over local control on that issue. Trying to see what else I've got here. Well, the other one is the draft, legislative draft concept of on the zoning, that you can't exceed certain zoning requirements and there are issues with that. I know if you recall on June 19th, when we met last time in DEQ, there are certain things where they said that we are more restrictive than the feds, and it's a good thing. And they kind of described the how and where and why, and there's a rationalization to it. And so that obviously when we draft something that says you can't exceed, there needs to be a reasonableness to it. So if there's a good justification or a rationalization. On the other hand, should you be sprinkling a 350 foot or a 600 foot mini home in Teton County under the new guidelines? And my understanding is you're going to have to start sprinkling any ARU. And so when we work through this ARU bill, we need to make sure that in terms of licensing, permitting, and sprinkling and code construction, that they can't exceed their requirements, because that defeats the purpose of what we're doing. So just got to keep that in mind. And I've got a couple others that are just kind of jotted down. There are rough notes that I'll also put down on an email and form. And then once I get them all, we'll kind of reconstitute them, play with them a little bit, and then we'll send them out to this working group, and then we'll send it out to the committee as a whole, so we can start directing this boat in a direction so we're all not flopping around in the pond. So other than that, and Mr. Co-Chair, any other concepts or ideas or suggestions? And Cindy, if you're around, please join us again and make sure we covered your concerns.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just, you know that I've spent a lot of time looking at local government law over the years, as my former assignment was executive director of the County Commissioners Association. So, the comprehensive land use plan and those statutes, and there's actually a state land use plan statute out there that could be worth taking a fresh look at as well, to see if there's any relevance in this discussion. The other piece that I think is really important to this conversation that was brought up by the co-chairman as well as Mr. Riemann is this notion of incentives. We can, once we figure out maybe some options for policy considerations to get, people where they think that we need to go on these various categories of housing, some low interest loans or zero interest loans, as the co-chairman said, to maybe try to, if we can't change some of these regulations, just for folks to have the ability maybe to get their arms around them a little easier without such an intensive front loading investment of capital. And I really thank Mr. Martin for bringing up, the uncertainty of the world and these days is a very real factor for entrepreneurs, and to have that enormous upfront capital investment on something that's very uncertain and in many places very inconsistent, that ability to just have a little bit more predictability as these projects move forward would probably go a long way as far as attracting investment in Wyoming. So thank you again for the opportunity. It's a fascinating conversation, one that I'm going to be thinking hard on. I know the rest of us will too, and looking forward to when we get together again.
Mike? You're muted. Sorry, the other Mike.
The other,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Senator Drew.
thanks, Mr. Co-Chair. I just wanted to highlight too, because there's a lot of material there to read. There's a letter that we received from the Gill family and the Jexel Hereford Ranch, which is one of the same. Talks about some issues too with regards to small mining operations on their property and some other issues that they're having in trying to develop their property, and that I'd like everybody to take a look at. And they asked me to say that because we didn't allow public comment today, and so I wanted to make sure that we highlighted that because it's in your packet. Thank you.
So, just to follow up on that comment, Senator Drew, the Minerals Committee just has a draft bill that they're going to finalize in November that modifies the mining permit process in Wyoming. And so as I understand it, what's transpired in Teton County is, if you have a small mining operation that's under 15 acres, that's exempt from regulation from DEQ, and so you can do it without any permits at all. But in Teton County, you have to have, what is it, BAC? I believe.
Yeah.
So they're just not granting any of those. So basically, they're shutting down all mining activities of any kind in Teton County. In fact, that's what they basically told the developers, that no mining, period.
And that's a bit of an issue that I think another one would really like to hear from the county about where they're coming from with that. So, thanks.
Okay. I don't have anything further. Hank, anything else we need to cover?
No, Mr. Chairman. The only thing I would say for those watching online is, again, note that we can still take written public comment after the fact, that you can email to staff, or we'll have that September 20th meeting in Lander that in-person public comment is available. The only other thing that I could think of is, I don't know if this working group wants to plan another meeting or save these kind of action items for the September meeting of the full task force. That's the only other thing I could think of at this point.
Yeah, let me follow up on that for the folks that who are listening. We would happy to take public comment on any suggestions, any modifications or responses to what we've talked about. And in terms of if we're going to have another meeting between now and September 20th, the good co-chair and I will chat on that. And then if there's a need, we'll put one together. But we kind of need to see how this assimilates in the next week before we get there. And really, that's only about 6.5 weeks away, or 7 weeks away, and it's amazing what we all have to do between now and then. We got to finish summer.
Yes, sir.
Well, Bob, thanks for all your comments and input. Representative Davis, everybody else, thanks everybody, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thanks,
Take
Chairman.
care. Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
for your good leadership.